Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is a little piece of heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 30, Escuadra en Mascara dos, Moonless Black Sun. While in pursuit of the elusive Ryotsu signature, Ichigo let go of his caution and hurried towards the wanted location as fast as he could. The spiritual energy felt faint, as if it was ready to disappear into the night and leave him with absolutely nothing but his own anxious thoughts. Far too desperate to let that happen, Ichigo growled. Then, like crashing into a concrete wall, he reached his destination. It was the abandoned warehouse he had first seen a few weeks before, and looking at it brought back some memories. However, he quickly pushed them aside and took a resolute step forward, inside the building. Almost immediately, the hair on the back of his neck stood up and he assumed a defensive stance. It felt like he just passed some invisible barrier made out of warm air, and as soon as he did that, the Ryotsu signature vanished and was replaced with several other, considerably more powerful, spiritual energies he did not recognize, yet they all felt somewhat familiar. Took ya long enough, Ichigo. As tense as he was, when Ichigo heard the voice, he instantly rolled away in anticipation of a strike to his body. But such thing never came. Don't be alarmed, we are not here to fight ya. The same voice called out to him from the darkness. Ichigo didn't feel like he could accept the sentiment. There was something strange about the male's voice, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. On the contrary, we wanna help ya. Feeling like the voice was coming closer to him, Ichigo twitched and glanced in the direction where he thought the man to appear. There, leisurely walking forward, was a man he did not recognize. The man was wearing ordinary clothes and, on first glance, he could have almost fooled Ichigo into thinking he was just an ordinary citizen. Almost. Aside from the man's normal, even if a bit eccentric appearance, there was a sword in his hand and also a hollow mask on his face, pushed aside just enough for Ichigo to see his human face. There was also massive spiritual energy radiating from the man. Ichigo took a step back in shock. What the? When the man continued to walk towards him, Ichigo quickly restored the state of his mind and raised his own sword. That's close enough. The man raised one eyebrow, then chuckled. Well, can't say I didn't expect some skepticism. Actually, I'd be annoyed to see none. Even disappointed. On the other hand, ya came here willingly, cause of your own curiosity, didn't ya? With narrowed eyes, Ichigo rewarded the man with a long, searching gaze, until he lowered his sword just a little bit and nodded with its tip towards the shadows. Tell them to come out. Forming a toothy grin, the man simply glanced to both sides and the darkness within the warehouse vanished with a flick of a switch, revealing 7 other figures staring at Ichigo from all around him, effectively surrounding him. That thought made Ichigo abandon the thought of completely putting away his sword. He looked back at the man. It looked like he was the leader. What now? The man's grin widened. Now, we introduce ourselves. We all know who ya are, Kurosaki Ichigo, but ya know nothing about us. And I say we don't change that. A brazen, female voice stated from behind Ichigo, causing the teen to slightly turn his neck and glance at the owner of the voice. It seemed to be a short girl in a red tracksuit, zipped open to reveal a loose tank top and a flat chest. You just thought that my chest is flat, didn't you? The girl suddenly growled with hostility in her eyes and Ichigo blinked in surprise. What? Well, you know what? I'm still developing and before long, my tits will be bigger than Lisa's. The girl growled again, prompting another person located on Ichigo's far right to snort derisively. PFF, you wish. What about Mashiro's? Slowly losing himself in the conversation, Ichigo completely lowered his sword before he even realized he had done so. Confused, he looked back at the leader of the group to see him sighing. Guys, later. See what I have to endure every single day, Ichigo? Now, to continue where I left off, I am Hirako Shinji. The man, Shinji, said while pointing at himself. After Ichigo nodded in acknowledgement, Shinji then pointed at the girl behind Ichigo. That's Saruga Kihiri. The ones bickering with her are Yodomaru Lisa and Kuna Mashiro. He said and then continued pointing his finger at the rest of the group. The one with an angry scowl is Meguruma Kensei. That's my resting face. Kensei grunted but Shinji ignored him. The fat guy is Ushota Hachigen. I'm just big-boned. Hachigen muttered in a sad tone but, just as with Kensei, Shinji ignored him. The one reading a manga and laughing like an idiot is Aiko will love. Dwahaha, this main character is retarded. What did you say, Shinji? Clearly frustrated by the lack of care from his colleagues, Shinji finally pointed at the last person, an elegant-looking gentleman in a black suit that had an absolutely bored expression. And this guy is Odoribashi Rajuro. Then Shinji opened his arms and brought back his grin. As a group, we are called Veizado. A group of Shinigami that, just like you, are in possession of inner hollows. There was a pause and it looked like he was expecting some sort of applause. He even remained motionless, stuck in the same pose, with his grin slowly widening. However, Ichigo just continued staring at him with narrowed eyes. Very slowly, the teen moved his eyes from side to side and looked over each member of the group. Then he tried to feel their spiritual energies. As he went over each person, his eyebrows moved towards each other until his brow looked like plowed soil. There was no way such powerful individuals could exist without Soul Society knowing about it. He was missing something. There was a thought in the back of his mind that was stubbornly, persistently trying to find its way to the front, where it could present itself to Ichigo in its full glory. Ichigo would easily allow it, but there was something odd. He could feel it, he just couldn't put his finger on it. Then a stray memory from months ago played itself like a short movie and the thoughts became complete. You were banished from Soul Society about a century ago, right? The grin on Shinji's face withered like a flower thrown into a sun. In its stead, a tasteless grimace appeared so fast, it told Ichigo everything he needed to know. Now why would you think so? Ichigo released a bit of air through his nostrils and licked his lower lip. I see. So that's what he meant by weakening the Godei. The teen muttered to himself as he gradually plunged into a swirling vortex of his own thoughts. Because of the glass look on his face, the Veizado group looked at him with confused stares, until Shinji heard his words and decided to clear his throat, to bring Ichigo back to the real world. Ichigo. Ichigo blinked several times and then pierced Shinji with an icy cold stare. You want revenge on Aizen? It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement and Ichigo didn't mean it in any other way. However, the mere mention of the former captain of the Godei 13 brought up a heated reaction where everyone's riot shot up exponentially and their stares turned deadly serious. Even Shinji, who looked like an easygoing guy, turned somber. It's interesting how fast you got it without me saying anything, he said humorlessly. And Urahara Kisuke's suggestion to take a walk outside didn't come to him just because he's such a caring person. There is no way a guy like him wouldn't know about you. Once again, Ichigo didn't ask and just made a comment. Still, Shinji clearly wanted to continue the conversation. Sounds like him, yes. Ichigo paused for a while and simply looked Shinji in the eyes, until either of them blinked. I hate that guy. That finally broke some ice and the Ryotsu of Veizado members plummeted down. Walking around Ichigo and taking a stand next to Shinji, Hiyori snorted and elbowed the leader of the group in his hip bone. Finally, somebody with a similar opinion. Shinji flinched and massaged the point of impact while giving the girl a nasty glare. After few rubs though, he looked back at Ichigo with a frown. I think there is no need for further introductions. You guessed it right, Ichigo. Because of a certain someone about a century ago and against our will, we gained a hollow taint and were banished from Soul Society. However, we managed to turn this disadvantage to our advantage. We gained control over our inner hollows and, since you are the guy everyone is seemingly putting hopes into, there was an idea of us helping you do the same. To gain control over your inner hollow. But first, come inside. 20 minutes later, after Ichigo properly greeted each and every member of the group, he and Shinji finally got to talk about the first and foremost thing they wanted to help Ichigo with. There is one thing I realized. You all talk about it like there is some sort of a separate entity within you that acts completely like a hollow and has barely anything to do with you. Ichigo said once he sat down on the ground and rested his backside against a wall. Looking at him strangely, Shinji blinked. Because it's true. It was Ichigo's turn to blink, causing Shinji to furrow his brow. You're saying it's different with you? I mean, I saw your rampage here in Karakura town and, well, it looked quite similar to how we have it. Rolling over the new information, Ichigo decided to ignore the disturbing comment about spying on him, and focused on developing the conversation. Maybe, but there is one distinct difference. The hollow part of me does not exist as a separate entity. Rather, it is fused together with my Zanpakuto spirit on such a deep level, they cannot be separated. There was a short silence and Ichigo realized the whole group was staring at him with their eyes bugged out, like he just grew a second head. Shinji managed to recover after a few seconds and he pierced Ichigo with a pointy stare. Are you absolutely sure? Why yeah, of course. I met the guy, talked with the guy and trained with the guy. He is a Zanpakuto spirit but he just has a nasty side that is hard to control. It's not like he's trying to kill me or anything. I mean, even when he does it, it's because he's trying to push me forward, so I can improve. It's just that the more power I draw from him, the stronger the hollow influence becomes and so if I don't keep my emotions in check I can lose control. Or something like that. Ichigo stammered and tried his best to explain to his best knowledge just how his power worked. Shinji's gaze lessened but he still remained deadly serious. He pinched the bridge of his nose and released a sigh. Well, shit. That changes things a bit. How so? Ichigo asked after relaxing again. In response, Shinji scratched the top of his head and tilted his head so he was looking at the teen from a weird angle. Then he wrinkled his nose. Well, the thing is, we were prepared to help you by making you go through the same training we did in order to gain control over our hollows but with this, our plan may not be the best idea. What we did was to battle our inner hollow within our mindscape what, after winning, forced them to retreat deep into the core of our souls, leaving us with the ability to don our masks that we use to augment our abilities and basic stats. Ichigo bunked the back of his head against the wall and sighed. Yeah, that won't work. Besides, there is no way in hell I can defeat my Zanpakuto spirit. Not yet, at least. That guy is insanely strong. Right, Zanjitsu. With his head turned towards the ceiling, Ichigo blinked. Zanjitsu. He felt a bead of cold sweat forming on his brow. Zanjitsu. But there was no answer. His Zanpakuto spirit was nowhere to be found and Ichigo felt his breathing rapidly increasing to the point where he wasn't sure whether he wasn't actually hyperventilating. So, what? Ichigo? Ichigo. Feeling a cold and hard surface beneath him, Ichigo's eyes suddenly popped open only to see nothing but a sky full of gray clouds. He moved his head from side to side and saw an endless field full of slowly decaying skyscrapers. A thunder resonated high above him and marked a start of a light rain that tickled his skin, chilled his bones. He was in his mindscape. With vigor he didn't know he possessed, Ichigo got back on his feet and frantically looked around. Zanjitsu! He exclaimed as loud as his vocal cords allowed him to, but no response came back. Dreading the possibility, Ichigo flashed to the top of the nearest skyscraper, but as soon as he landed, the structure groaned in protest and began to tremble. In the nick of the time, Ichigo managed to regain his footing and jump away, only to watch the building finally give in to the decay and tumbling down in a cloud of smoke and debris. He knew that such a thing must have meant something important, something vital to the vitality of his own mind, but the fear of losing his Zanpakuto spirit caused him to ignore that thought. Zanjitsu! Another skyscraper came crashing down, now even without him touching it. Along with it, the rain grew thicker and the water from it began to accumulate, slowly forming an ocean of regret and anxiety. Zanjitsu, please, where are you? What started as another yell, ended in a bleak whisper. However, as much as he screamed, as much as he pleaded and begged, wished, and desired, his Zanpakuto spirit remained silent and hidden, leaving not even a trace of his very existence. The realization shocked him to the core and so he didn't even try to stop himself from falling into the ocean below him. The water current tugged on him and dragged him into the ocean's depth, when the only thing he could feel was the pain in his eardrums as the mass of water tried to rip them open. Ichigo fought against it. He tried to pry himself out of the tight embrace of regret, but it was like cutting time and rewriting the fate itself. Impossible. But he wasn't about to give up that easily. He had gone through too much shit to get defeated with just that much. His skin was thicker than ever, and even though his mind remained as fragile as it had been years ago, it was now coated in a protective blanket that was far too durable for this event to break it open. So, he kicked the negative emotions right into their distorted reflection and pushed forward. Yet, despite his most stubborn protest, the light slowly began to fade away and his body sank deeper and deeper. With clenched teeth, he cursed his own weakness. "You are not weak." His eyes snapped open when a familiar voice sounded close to him and strong hands grabbed him by his shoulder and yanked him away from the depths of gloom. He landed on a small skyscraper, the only one still standing strong and proud. "Old man Waiwak." Ichigo muttered and raised his head to see his inner spirit looking at him with a worried expression. "I thought I told you before, Ichigo. I hate the rain." A smile found its way on Ichigo's face. It was small, almost shy, but it did exist. And its very existence brought back some of the energy Ichigo lost within the ocean. "Yeah, I know. I wasn't prepared." "You can never be, Ichigo. But you can get strong, so when then the time for despair comes, you can endure it on your own and without any help." The spirit said and offered him a helping hand. Grateful, Ichigo took it and stood back up. "Where is he, old man?" His tone wasn't too earnest, but it was honest enough for the spirit to briefly close his eyes. "Do you truly not know, Ichigo? You are him as much as he is you. But if you still don't know, it is because you don't know yourself. And how else do you expect to understand him but by understanding your own soul?" Staring at the spirit in silence, Ichigo felt his throat drying up and he gulped. "It is because I disappointed him. Because I couldn't keep my emotions in check and turned into a complete hollow." The spirit opened his eyes and returned his stare. "Is it truly? Or is it because you still treat your hollow self as something you appear to have accepted, yet deep down, in the very core of your soul, you treat it like an infection you learned to live with yet never tried to truly understand?" Flinching, Ichigo closed his eyes and snorted without any joy. "Perhaps." After Ichigo woke up from the forced visit to his mindscape, he did his best to calm Shinji and the rest of the Vazado group and assured them he was quite fine, that what happened to him was just a byproduct of his inner spirit pulling him away from the real world. Then he decided that Vazado method of training, minus the beating down his inner spirit, was still his best shot at figuring things out. The rest of the day as well as most of the following morning Ichigo spent training with each and every single member of the group. One by one, they switched, so each time Ichigo faced somebody, his opponent was fresh and rested. But because he couldn't do the most important thing of their training, his progress in figuring how to control his hollow part was practically non-existent. Although, it would be unfair to call his hard work pointless. He did gain something. Ichigo wasn't quite sure why, but the more he sparred with Vazado while they used their masks, the more his own hollow mask grew in size. It was just a small increase, but it was still better than nothing. Though he had yet to feel any increase in power. When he asked Shinji, the man seemed convinced it was because their training was good for something after all. Ichigo didn't buy it. However, even these gains stopped after the second day ended. On the third day, Ichigo decided to just rest and muse over the situation. That was also when an urgent message from Urahara reached him through one of the Vazado members. "Urahara-san is asking for you, Ichigo-san. It seems there is an emergency in Seoul Society." Hachigen, the largest of the group, called out to him, causing the whole building to go quiet. Ichigo's eyes narrowed to slits and he quickly, but quietly, weighed his options. Meanwhile, Hiyori scoffed at the news and negatively shook her head. "Screw them. What difference can one person make? This is important." From a nearby bench, Kensei cracked his knuckles. "For once, I agree with her." Sitting opposite of Ichigo, Shinji remained silent and simply watched as Ichigo's brows moved in sync with his thought process. Before the others could offer their own opinions, Shinji raised his arm and slightly shook it. That stopped anyone from speaking and, together, they waited for Ichigo to make a decision. After several more seconds, the teen looked up with a frown on his face. "I think that once I go, it will take some time before I could even think of coming back. There's no way they'll let me go without any punishment." He mused and carefully studied Shinji's reaction. But the leader of the Vazado group remained stoic and returned his searching gaze with one of his own. Most likely, yes. On the other hand, while I made a tiny progress with increasing the size of my mask, I got absolutely nowhere with the root of the problem. Ichigo continued and Shinji countered without any pause. It took us nearly a century to get where we are. Besides, completing the mask may be tied to the solution. Maybe, but I clearly cannot stay here for that long. I think I'll have to find the solution elsewhere and on my own. Not that I'm not grateful to you lot. Shinji's facade cracked a little at that, allowing a ghost smile to play on his lips. Or yeah, just stating things, convincing yourself, asking for permission or expecting an advice. Ichigo's expression broke as well and he snorted. A bit of everything, he said and grabbed his sword while standing up. Wordlessly, with just simple nods, he said his goodbyes to the members of the group and then, with a Zanpakuto in his hand, he walked towards the entrance of the warehouse. Before he reached it though, he heard somebody clearing his throat. Well, Ichigo, it's been nice knowing ya, but before ya leave, there is one more thing ya should know. Seeing Shinji with one of his more serious expressions, Ichigo gave him a nod. I think I know it already. Even after a century, you are still living behind a barrier, so you don't want to be found or don't want anyone to know you are alive. Especially the one who shall not be named. Shinji stared at him for a few seconds before releasing a sharp snort. Clever bastard. Ichigo chuckled and then waved his hand at the man. Don't worry, I'm not planning on exposing you. There is nothing I'd gain from that. Besides, you are not that bad. Get out of here, ya bastard. Chuckling again, Ichigo turned away from the group and walked through the large doors. Once he was out, the entrance closed and he lost his positivity. Leaning backwards, he stared at the sunny sky and sighed heavily. Some sort of emergency, huh? Sure, let me just rush to Soul Society without knowing anything else. He muttered and brought his head back down, to stare at the road ahead of him. I hate his vague bullshit. With another sigh, he discarded the simple option of just opening the Senkaimon on his own and aimed his steps towards Urahara's shop, in hopes of gaining some additional information about the situation. While walking, he heard the only remaining inner spirit clear his throat. What is it, old man? There was a brief pause. It feels like you didn't really enjoy your stay with these Vazado. You said you did, but that wasn't complete truth. Not expecting such a statement, Ichigo almost tripped and fell, regaining his footing only in the last moment. Continuing like nothing happened, he took a deep breath. I don't know. They seem nice enough, but it was like they were missing something. Some part that I could connect with. Despite having a part of hollow in them, they never seemed to act differently with or without the mask. Maybe they are used to it, but I felt no connection. Maybe it's because I'm also a part Quincy and they are not. I don't know. He mentally stated, while carefully watching his steps as he maneuvered around a large mass of people that appeared once he got to a busy part of the town. His inner spirit reacted to his words and thoughts only once he reached a quiet street and had time to relax. Or maybe you couldn't connect because they never seemed to truly look at you. Huh? What do you mean? But he was already standing in front of Urahara's shop and his inner spirit quickly receded into the deeper parts of his soul, from where the teen couldn't hear him, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Urahara. Ichigo didn't even raise his voice to call out to the scientist. He was sure that the man was already expecting him and that he had already felt him approaching. He was proven right only a moment later when the said man opened the doors and invited him inside with a simple wave of a hand. I see you listened to my advice and took quite the stroll. When he walked past the scientist, Ichigo gave him a nasty look but managed to keep his patience and didn't lash out. Hi, bastard. He thought and clenched his jaw, refusing to say anything until he reached the underground area where he was planning on opening Senkaimon. To his surprise, Urahara didn't seem to have any problems with the silence and the two of them walked through the shop in silence. It was when his feet touched the ground of the underground area that Ichigo looked at Urahara with serious gaze. So, what exactly is this emergency? Are we under attack or is it something else? Urahara met his eyes and slightly shook his head. Hard to say what exactly happened. However, it seems that every student in the academy that used to be a regular in Aizen's calligraphy class vanished. That's the extent of my information, I'm afraid. I'm sure that thanks to Captain Kurotsuka the Godai has the specifics, so you'll have to ask them. Ichigo tried to listen to him with a cool head, and so he kept his composure all the way to the end. When the man finished talking, he raised his right hand and rubbed the tip of his chin. While that is indeed not a good thing, it certainly doesn't sound that urgent. Narrowing his eyes just a tiny bit, Urahara's stare seemed to change and Ichigo felt something in the man's mood shifted. You used to be a regular in his class as well, Kurosaka-san. I'm sure you get the implications. At first, Ichigo just blinked, but then the realization hit him and caused him to slap himself on the forehead without even trying to lessen the impact. The slap left a pink mark on his skin, but he couldn't care less. He sighed in resignation and released a little groan at the end. I see, so the event itself isn't the emergency. Me being out of harm's way just at the right time is. Great. I'm so not looking forward to this. He muttered to himself. Then he nodded to Urahara and grabbed his Zanpakuto, only to thrust it into the air in front of him, forcing a Senkaimon to appear in a flash. Goodbye, Kurosaka-san. Ichigo knew something was wrong the very first second his feet touched the ground of Siraidai and he didn't see anyone in his vicinity. It was not like he expected somebody to greet him. Shinigami used Senkaimon all the time. However, the fact that not even the Senkaimon usual guards, members of the Kido Corps, were present worried him greatly. There wasn't even any sound or noise coming from the usually busy center of the Siraidai. Suddenly feeling extremely exposed, Ichigo sharpened his senses and took few quick steps. He managed to take only 3 before something incredibly fast flashed behind him and his nose hit the ground before he could react. Ow, I give. Whatever it is, I'll go peacefully. His muffled protests were halted when he felt something cold and sharp pressed against the back of his neck. A voice then came from such close distance to his ear, it made him shudder. Be quiet, Kurosaki. He blinked in surprise. Captain Sui Feng. What dash? I said be quiet. The captain of the 2nd Division hissed and pushed his face further into the ground, instantly preventing him from speaking any further. Then she loosened the grip, but only slightly. Ichigo was still unable to move and so he remained still and silent. Sui Feng lowered herself and he could feel her mouth almost touching his ear. Good. We don't have much time, so listen to me very carefully. You screwed up big time, Kurosaki. Your life is on the line here, but, fortunately for you, I have a solution that will benefit everyone, maybe even you. When she paused to take a breath, Ichigo forcefully scratched his face across the ground to free his mouth and then looked her in the eye. Is this a revenge for Uruaki Shihoan? Sui Feng's gaze darkened a bit and he could almost see the inner conflict happening within her mind. However, the captain quickly got rid of her thoughts and narrowed her eyes at him. I can still make it so, if you want. But no. Before I am a person, I am the captain of the Godai 13 and it's my job to make hard decisions. This is one of these decisions. Kurosaki. She trailed off and closed on him even more, shortening the distance between their eyes until it was barely an inch. I'm giving you a chance to make things right. I'm giving you a chance to prove yourself. Above everything else, I'm putting all of my trust into you, because Uruaki-sama thinks you are worth it. Do not make me regret it. Ichigo felt his breath stuck and, in the face of Sui Feng's intense stare, he could only gulp. Then, as much as he could move, he nodded. Sui Feng's expression changed and she nodded as well. Now, listen closely. Chapter 31, Prelude to Lucifer's Deception, Lunar Maria. Several long minutes later, Ichigo found himself walking in front of Sui Feng with his hands bound together with an exceptionally powerful Bakudo. There were multiple Onmitsukido troops guarding him from all sides and a few members of Kido Corps were keeping close eye on the durability of the binding spell. All in all, he was surrounded, rendering any potential escape attempt practically pointless. In a group, they all walked towards the large room in the 1st Division barracks that served as the place for any and all captains' meetings. The large doors opened and Ichigo's guards stopped moving. Only he and Captain Sui Feng entered the room full of captains, all standing in 2 separate rows, one on the left and one on the right side. Kurosaki Ichigo. Receiving a slight poke to his backside, Ichigo walked further into the room, until he was standing right in front of the captain commander and between the two rows of captains. Behind him, Sui Feng moved away and joined her colleagues. From the corner of his eye, Ichigo noticed his father looking at him with a worried expression. "Sorry, Dad." "Kurosaki Ichigo. You are here today because of your transgressions. Are you aware of what you have done?" Ichigo kept his gaze pointed at the commander, but on the inside, he felt incredibly nervous. "I am." The commander slightly opened his eyes and looked at him through tiny slits. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ichigo slightly nodded his head and turned towards his father. "I'm sorry." When he said that, Ishine looked like he got hit with an arrow and a pained expression crossed his features. Ichigo turned back towards the commander, who stared at him emotionless. "Anything else?" Gathering the last bit of courage, Ichigo released a short snort. "Not worth it. Nothing I say will change your minds. I was guilty before I even did anything." Several murmurs came from both sides and the commander tapped the floor with his cane. "What are you implying, Kurosaki Ichigo?" "Nothing." He could feel the commander's riots arising and fought the urge to wipe the one bead of sweat from his forehead that formed because of it. He couldn't afford to lose his grip, not yet. The game had only just begun. Kurosaki Ichigo. In the past instances where individuals gained powers of a hollow, these individuals have always been sentenced to death. A Shinigami that has broken the boundary of his soul with the use of a hollow is an exceptionally unstable being that quickly regresses into an animalistic state where it can no longer distinguish between an ally and a foe. It's a being that is powerful and dangerous to everyone around it. The commander lengthily explained as he cast a stare at his fellow captains. "You are the first exception to the rule as you appear to be in control most of the time. By not forfeiting your life, I'm making you my responsibility, and believe me when I say, Kurosaki Ichigo, that if you ever lose control and turn into a mindless beast again, I will not hesitate and use all of the power at my disposal to disintegrate you. Is that clear?" There was a short moment of deafening silence, after which some of the captains started to whisper among each other with greater vigor than before. Ignoring those murmurs, Ichigo opened his mouth to speak, but the commander prevented him from doing so with another tap to the floor. "However, your existence is not the purpose of this meeting. Because the Central 46 won't be renewed for some time, it is I who will decide it in matters such as these. You have still broken laws and so you are to be punished. We are at war, though, which means incarcerating a potential asset would be counterproductive. Therefore, at the very least, you are to be carefully examined so that the captain of the 12th Division can create an antidote that will prevent you from excessively tapping into your hollow powers and threatening your allies whether on battlefield or during peace times." Somewhere out of his vision, Ichigo could feel Kurotsuke Mayuri rubbing his hands and licking his lips in state of absolute excitement. It made his skin crawl. He shuddered and quickly took a carefully hidden peek to Sui Feng's face. She appeared to be not looking at him, but as soon as his eyes found her, he could see her stealthily giving a short nod. He gulped and then looked back at the commander, who was penetrating him with a powerful gaze. Inhaling deeply, Ichigo forced himself to stay calm. Then he opened his mouth and formed a distressed expression. "Are you out of your mind? Do you know what will that freak do to me? What he does to his own men? I'll be left drooling and unable to form a coherent thought for the rest of my life. You can't do this," he rapidly exclaimed, causing other captains to look at each other, at him and at Kurotsuke Mayuri as well. "He's right, Commander." There's no telling what Decius Hine tried to support his son, but the cane of the commander hit the ground with enough power to create sparks and release a blast of air. "Silence," he stated loudly and then looked down at Ichigo. "Tonight, you will be escorted to the laboratory of the 12th Division. My decision is final. Guards, take him away." Ichigo growled, and when he felt unknown hands touching his shoulder, he began to struggle. However, in the room filled with the upper echelon of the Godai 13, he was eventually restrained with multiple layers of Kido spells that rendered him immobile and silent. He could hear his father loudly protesting and, in his mind, he prayed for the man's safety. Before he was finally knocked out, he managed to sneak a glance at the captain of the 2nd Division. She was grinning. Coincidentally with the captain's meeting, a meeting of the vice captains and some other important officers took place not that far away. If only because of the gravity of the situation, everyone was present and they all quietly discussed the current situation, eagerly awaiting any news from their respective captains. Eventually, they waited long enough and, truth to the word, the news about the development of Ichigo's case were passed on to them. Those news came like a corroding bullet that creeped into the officers like poison, developing a discord fast. Like I said before, my captain thinks highly of him, but I think this punishment is way too lax. Nanao Ise, the vice captain of the 8th Division, suddenly broke the quiet murmurs with a loud statement. Almost immediately, she encountered different reactions. Do you have any idea what you are talking about? Hisagi asked and stared at her as if she just grew a second pair of arms. Seemingly offended by the accusation, Nanao pushed her glasses up her nose. Of course I do. Have you ever been to the 12th Division's laboratories? Kira asked her in his usual quiet demeanor and he, along with the rest, turned their heads to look at the vice captain of said division, Nimue. The young woman took the stairs with grace and simply shook her head. I cannot speak of Mayuri-sama's experiments and projects. Nanao glanced at Kira. Well, no. I haven't. What is your point? His point is that you think you know what you are talking about, yet you clearly don't, Nanao-chan. Being sentenced to undergo an examination at 12th Division is worse than being incarcerated. I'd say it's even worse than being just outright executed. Rangiku explained in Kira's stead, causing Nanao to look at her in slight disbelief. I heard he doesn't treat his men very well, but I think you are overreacting. He was told not to harm Kurosaki. Besides, this is for the good of the whole Siridi. I, for one, can't imagine what it would be if a Shinigami Hollow hybrid ran amok in the middle of the Siridi. She said, prompting another person to come to her aid. I actually agree with her. Tetsuzumon Iba, the vice captain of the 7th Division, stated roughly. His attitude quickly caused more officers to join the great debate. Seriously? I thought you of all people wouldn't hold prejudice against those that differ from the others, Iba-san. Yumi Chika quipped from behind him as Ikeku, who was sitting next to him, joined him with a nod. In response, Iba reached for the dark sunglasses he wore all the time and took them down, allowing them to see his narrowed eyes. What's that supposed to mean? It's no longer a secret that Captain Komamura is an anthropomorphic wolf, so it stands to reason that you would agree with not discriminating against Ichigo. Renji called out to him with his eyes narrowed as well. Before Iba could react, Nanao spoke first. But it's not a discrimination. We are talking about somebody that could potentially turn out to be a great threat for dozens, if not hundreds of officers or innocent souls. She exclaimed, her voice slowly gaining an irritated tint. I'm actually surprised Captain didn't kill him on the spot. The vice captain of the 2nd Division, Mareki Yoomada, lazily said from his soft-looking couch. Don't speak of death so easily. Killing should be the last thing you do. What you should speak of, is the reason behind him actually turning to a hollow. Most of you know Kurosaki, you know how he is. He managed to control his hollow part for so long, yet now he snapped? We should be helping him, trying to understand his reasons, not immediately disregarding him as an inconvenience. Hisagi stated in a quiet, yet powerful voice, that briefly silenced all of them. Why you haven't seen him going berserk, Hisagi-san? I was there, after his last spar with Captain Zaraki, when he argued with Captain Anohana. I haven't seen anyone so scary. And it wasn't his hollow, it was more of it was the look in his eyes. It was like looking into an endless abyss, something so dark it could swallow you whole. The one who dared to break the silence was the vice captain of the 4th Division, Isane. She spoke quietly, but the expression on her face as she spoke told more than she could with words alone. He's not a monster. Rukia protested, but her words were unable to get through to the gentle medic. Wait, so you actually agree he should be given to the 12th Division so they could experiment on him? Renji asked, not even realizing his voice was getting louder. His face was twitching as his anger became obvious. Rukia placed one of her hands on his in an attempt to calm him down. Experiment is not the right word, though we should have something that could stop him as soon as he starts showing symptoms of turning again. Or would you like to use your approach and just talk to him while he's mowing us down one by one? Nanao retorted and took a few steps to stand next to Isane. No. We should talk to him before that happens. Hisagi argued in an even voice. Where's the guarantee it will help? Omada inquired. Where's the guarantee experimenting on him will help? Renji glanced at Rukia and, after she took her hand away, crossed his arms so he could show his protest. But this is more than just him being partly a hollow. Do you think it's a coincidence that those students vanished exactly when he wasn't here? The discussion lasted for more than an hour, both sides unwilling to let go of their arguments. It only ended after the meeting was officially dismissed and everyone went their own ways. They managed to remain civil, but the discord did not disappear. The corrosion was still flowing within their veins. The fear of unknown and uncontrolled was far too powerful for some of them to just let go. As they slowly departed, two officers walked away together, whispering to each other in turns. The two of them strongly believed in their truth and in their opinion and were reluctant to just let their mutual friend go to the pits of hell called Laboratory of Kuratsuka Mayuri. They did say they are going to escort him, so I think that's our only chance. Renji whispered while carefully watching his surroundings. Next to him, looking straight ahead, Rukia shivered. You know this is insubordination, right? We'll be in a lot of trouble for this. She muttered. I know, but, like I told you, I owe him. I can't just let him go to that madman. He'll butcher him, turn him inside out and then throw him away, unable to form a single thought. Rukia formed a tiny smile. I didn't think you had it in you, Renji. When he heard the gentle tone of Rukia's voice, Renji's legs shook and he almost tripped. A smile formed on his own face. Like I said, I owe him and I will make it count. I didn't do anything when they threw him in prison, but now it's different. I have to do this. He stated, his voice filled with determination. He could feel Rukia's hand lightly touching his elbow. Thank you. She muttered. Then, the two of them stopped moving and their expressions froze. There was a cold steel of a blade pressed against Renji's jugular and a stealthy Kido bound Rukia's hands behind her back. Alarmed, they glanced at each other, but the movement caused the sharp blade to draw a drop of blood from Renji's neck. What is this that I hear? Two officers of Godi I-13 conspiring together to help a criminal. Sickly sweet voice whispered to them from behind, causing both of them to stiffen in fear. See Captain Sui Feng. Renji gulped and tried to ignore the unpleasant sensation of steel digging into his skin. Quiet. Do you see that abandoned shack on the right? Go there and wait. And just like that, the pressure on Renji's neck disappeared along with the binding spell on Rukia. The two of them shook and glanced at each other. There was no need for words. They both knew they were in big trouble, but they also knew it was pointless to try and run. The captain of the 2nd Division could run circles around them in time it took them to even blink. Wordlessly, they nodded to each other and walked over to the shack. Hesitating just a little, they entered. Good. The voice of the captain came so suddenly, they both jumped in surprise. The building was devoid of any source of light and so they couldn't see a thing. Now, you will both listen to me very carefully. I have no intention of arresting you, so relax. It's actually the opposite. 3 hours later, Renji and Rukia stealthily approached their destination, clad in full cloaks that obscured their faces to the point it was impossible to recognize them by anything else but their spiritual energy signatures. Even that was difficult as they both kept it as low as possible. With the help of the night cloudy sky, they moved through the Siridi unseen and unheard. It didn't take them long before they landed on the short wall on the side of a long walkway that went all the way to the 12th Division barracks, hidden in a distance. They should be here in a few minutes. Renji whispered as quietly as he could. I just hope they really will be alone. Rukia retorted quietly as well. They glanced at each other and took a few calming breaths. She promised they will. That she did. In just 2 minutes, they noticed a small convoy slowly getting closer. Straining her eyes, Rukia visually confirmed their suspicions and she gave Renji a short nod. The vice-captain of the 6th Division nodded as well and prepared himself. When the convoy got on a speaking distance, they both acted. A member of Kido Corps raised his eyebrow when he felt a light breeze blowing past him before something hit him hard and his eyes rolled to the back of his head. By the time his body hit the ground, the rest of the guards realized the situation and took their positions to release a barrage of spells, only to experience the same hits. 2 of them managed to form spells, but they were too slow in firing them and the accumulated energy in their hands slowly dissipated into the air. Phew, that went well. Renji muttered, and then he, along with Rukia, looked at the person the guards had been guarding and escorting. Ichigo. Rukia whispered and hurried towards him to release all the bindings that prevented him from moving, only to see him forming an apologetic, sad smile. I'm sorry, guys. Confused, Rukia felt something hitting her in the back of her head and she immediately lost her consciousness. Widening his eyes, Renji grabbed the hilt of his Zanpakuto only to receive the same hit and his body slid to the ground just when the light vanished from his eyes. Blinking, Renji felt himself slowly gaining his consciousness, and when he opened his eyes and the sunlight entered his vision, he groaned in discomfort. Then he recalled what happened and frantically tried to get up, only to find out he was unable to move. What the? Then he noticed Rukia lying next to him, with her eyes opened and giving him the same look of anxiety he felt himself. Abarai Renji, Kukaki Rukia. You were both caught trying to set free a known criminal, Kurosaki Ichigo. For this crime, you are to be judged and punished. They both widened their eyes and tried to look up, to see the captain of the 2nd Division standing above them, with a crowd of other people staring at them in disbelief. Almost immediately, Renji felt a burning fire spreading within his body and his face twisted into an angry grimace. You tried. He was unable to finish his sentence because Sui Fang placed her foot on his head and pushed his face into the ground. Rukia tried to protest but met the same fate. Get them up. Sui Fang said, and a handful of Kido Corps members forced both Renji and Rukia on their feet, but not before throwing a multitude of restricting Kido spells on them. Good. I will escort them personally. Sui Fang said authoritatively, so that nobody present could object. As soon as she said that, she pushed the 2 bound officers and forced them to walk in front of her. Because of the spells, they were both unable to talk or concentrate on using their spiritual energy, and the only thing they could do was to move their legs. When they were far away from the crowd, Sui Fang rotated them just a little bit and forced them to move in a different direction. Forced to be silent, neither Rukia nor Renji could speak their minds, but they could still alter their expressions. They were severely confused. After another 15 minutes, they reached the bridge to the Central 46 compound. It was guarded by several guards, and so Sui Fang placed a hand in front of Rukia and Renji so they would stop walking. Captain Sui Fang. The guards bowed a little and stared at the 2 prisoners with questioning eyes, prompting the captain of the 2nd Division to quickly form a friendlier expression. She pointed at Rukia and then at Renji. These 2 have broken the law and are to be judged in the underground assembly hall, she said. The guards glanced at each other. Sir, but the Central 46 hasn't been reformed yet. Yes, I am well aware. However, the captain commander managed to create a small assembly and wants these 2 to be judged by them as a test of their reliability. This should suffice. Sui Fang replied and handed the guards a small piece of paper. The guards narrowed their eyes but moved their sights on the paper. After a few seconds, they bowed and allowed the captain a passage. She nudged both Renji and Rukia to move. Once they entered the building and the elevator in it, she pressed a single button. The elevator began to move with a low humming. When they reached the wanted floor, she pushed both of them out of the elevator. Then, all of a sudden, every single Kido spell placed on both Rukia and Renji vanished. The 2 of them blinked in surprise and glanced at the captain of the 2nd Division. Then they looked back at the place in front of them. This isn't the assembly hall. Landing head first in an endless sea of sand, Ichigo coughed and rolled over on his back. For a moment, he spat away all the sand particles that got into his mouth, and then, while looking at the never-ending night of the Hueco Mundo and its persistent moon, he released a deep, heavy sigh. I hope she won't hurt them. Then he just breathed in silence. As far as he was able to tell, there wasn't any spiritual signature in his vicinity, which meant either he landed in an empty part of Hueco Mundo or Hollows didn't smell him yet. It somewhat calmed him down and he allowed himself to close his eyes and just ponder about the thoughts that plagued his mind. What should I do now? It all happened so fast. It had been only a few days, but here he was, once again, in the land of the Hollows. Once again, against his will. Technically. However, there wasn't much to think about. Even if his mind was filled with weird conclusions and ideas, Ichigo knew he had other things to do. With that in mind, he opened his eyes and slowly got back up on his feet. Unsteady on the sand dune, he dusted himself from the sand and looked into the distance. As he glanced from one side to another, there was only a large mass of sand that could fill entire oceans. With no landmarks and no stars, there was nothing he could use for guidance. Ever so rare, there were some ashen-looking tree constructs, but they were far too small to be considered important. Another sigh was digging its way out of his chest and Ichigo couldn't help but to release him. It was all just so overwhelming. Yeah, I don't think we thought this through. He muttered with his head lowered in defeat. But the emotion was fleeting and lasted for just a few seconds. Then his face hardened in concentration. I guess I'll have to widen the amount of space I can cover with my spiritual energy sensor. I just hope I won't get immediately swarmed. He thought and slowly brought his hands together. Squinting at the moonlight, he closed his eyes and the crease on his brow grew profound. A light, weak pulse of spiritual energy exploded from within him and traveled across the dunes of sand like a gentle breeze, blowing few sand particles along its way. Ichigo remained in his pose for a while longer and released another pulse, this one even weaker than the first. Then he waited and concentrated on his senses. After more than half a minute, one of his eyes opened, followed with the other one only mere seconds later. There was a thoughtful expression forming on his face and his glassy stare gave away no thought. This state lasted only for a while and, once it ended, Ichigo turned slightly to his right. I suppose I have to start somewhere. He stated and started walking in the chosen direction with his head high and his shoulders tense. It was practically his first time in Hueco Mundo while in control of his own self and he wasn't really sure what to expect from such a place. Only thing he knew from the academy literature, and that wasn't much. However, he was sure he shouldn't lower his caution and expect anything good. While not exactly a hellhole, Hueco Mundo was the world of hollows and that spoke for itself. Therefore, Ichigo moved at brisk pace but kept glancing at his surroundings, in case a hollow decided to try itself out on him and attack him from a blind spot. I should have borrowed one of Amagi-san's energy bars because I have a feeling I'll be stuck here for a while without any food or water. He muttered, disgruntled. Then he guffawed. Ha! Like I'd eat that stony brick. My teeth still hurt from the last time I took a bite. Unaware of just how ridiculous he must have seemed to an outside observer, talking to himself in a land devoid of life, Ichigo continued his stride without lowering his swift pace. Hueco Mundo was a land of eternal night and so he didn't have to think about the sun suddenly rising and animals waking up. If there is anything in Hueco Mundo that resembles life, it is most likely not asleep. He thought. Then he felt a foreign spiritual signature closing in on him. He shook his head. Me and my big mouth. Though, technically, I didn't say it out loud. Yeah. A large hollow that reminded Ichigo a mixture of a bear and a praying mantis appeared in his vision just after it leaped in the air. Ichigo watched its trajectory very carefully and realized he had to alter his own. The creature was clearly aiming to crush him under its weight. He waited till the last moment and only when the large body was about to hit him, he swiftly hopped away. Once the hollow hit the ground, Ichigo waited no time before jumping above it and reaching for his Zanpakuto. In midair, he pointed his sword down and then let himself fall down. Before the large hollow realized what happened, Ichigo's Zanpakuto pierced right through it and pinned it to the ground. Gyaya! It roared in pain but Ichigo quickly dragged his sword through the creature and cut through most of its body, causing it to spasm in shock and then disintegrate into spirit particles. Brutal, but effective, purification was complete. Without giving the slowly dissipating Reishi any attention, Ichigo turned away and leaned into his feet to continue walking but then felt something odd. He glanced back, but the hollow's corpse was already gone and there was nothing else that could cause the sensation. Ichigo blinked multiple times and his eyes darted back and forth, though he was still unable to determine the origin of that weirdness. Narrowing his eyes, he slowly turned his head and started to walk. The sand dunes beneath his feet regularly gave away under the pressure of his weight and soon, Ichigo couldn't help himself but growl in frustration. The sand was ever present, and because of his footwear, he could feel it under his toes, between his toes and on his toes. It was almost as if his socks didn't exist. At first, it was annoying, but the more distance he covered, the more sand got caught between the fabric and the surface of his legs, and the particles irritated his skin. When he was about to snap, he sensed two hollows approaching him at a fast pace. A nasty grin formed on his face, and he reached for the hilt of his sword. When the hollows entered his vision, he readied himself. Just like with his previous victim, he waited until the last moment and moved away only when the hollow was almost in his face. Brandishing his Zanpakuto along the hollow's side, he ripped the creature open. Without losing his momentum, he spun around it and slashed against the second hollow that jumped at him from the opposite direction. He barely felt the resistance of the flesh and, before the creature realized it, he cleaved it in two halves. Both hollows were dead before they even hit the ground, and Ichigo stopped moving. No wonder it's so easy. These are just regular hollows. He muttered when he took a closer look at the creatures that were slowly getting purified. It was then when he felt another odd sensation, and he quickly looked around to find the source of it. When he did, his eyes bugged out. What the hell? As the hollows' corpses turned into spiritual particles, some of them found their way to the tip of Ichigo's Zanpakuto, and, at the point of contact, the particles dimly glowed and seemingly entered the steel of the sword. Watching it unfold before his very eyes, Ichigo tilted his head and tried to think of an explanation, but drew only blanks. If only I could speak to Zanjutsu, he thought. Then he realized what his words meant and felt himself getting sad. Inhaling sharply, he sheathed his Zanpakuto and resolutely shook his head. Then he looked into distance and exhaled. I still have a long way to go. With that in mind, he got moving once more. However, the problem of the annoying sand returned in just a few minutes and turned his journey into one of constant swearing, angry scowls, and occasional kicks in the air. It didn't take long before Ichigo declared a total war on the dried land and took his Zanpakuto out of its sheath. Putting all of the frustration into the sword, he swung as hard as he could and watched in satisfaction as the wind pressure blew large amount of sand away from him. But the elation from victory lasted only for a moment, and a sour expression crawled onto his face. Son of a... he blurted when he realized his attempt had been completely pointless, as beneath all the sand he had just blown away, only more sand awaited. Cursing his own naivete, he stomped on the dune and then let himself fall down. After his ass hit the soft ground, he stuck his legs forward and decisively took off his sandals and then the socks as well. He dusted his feet and felt an extreme bliss spreading all the way from the soles of his feet to the tip of his head. Ah, freedom! He moaned in satisfaction and closed his eyes. For a while, he just sat there and let the moonlight tickle his body. A smile of a man that had fought against the windmills and won spread across his face. Many things happened and many things were about to happen, yet for just a fragment of time, he felt good. Then his eyes snapped open and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. Is 5 minutes too much to ask? 4 spiritual signatures blinked into existence way closer than he would have been comfortable with, leaving him with no other choice but to interrupt his rest. Like a squashed spring, he sprang into action in a split second, and so when the hollows reached him, he was already prepared. What he wasn't prepared though, was the ground giving way under the weight of all 4 creatures hitting it at the same time. In a terrifying groan, the earth collapsed and opened up a large hole so dark, Ichigo couldn't even fathom just how deep it was. He tried to get away, to somehow leap away, but one of the hollow's claws found him and the weight of the hollow snatched him from the air and forced him to experience a free fall. Oh shit! He screamed and felt his breath getting faster from the sheer fear of potentially falling to his death. I can barely see anything. He thought in alarm and prayed there wasn't anything he could hit on his way down, aside from the inevitable bottom of the abyss itself. Unfortunately for him, as soon as he thought about it, a sturdy-looking spike rose from the darkness right below his legs. Because of the lack of light, he spotted it far too late, and even though he tried to bring his knees to his chest, he felt the tip of the protrusion tearing through his left calf muscle. Tears immediately formed in his eyes. Oh crap! He whispered when something briefly illuminated the area below him and he saw dozens of similar spikes scattered all around. I should have learned more Kido. His eyes widened as a desperate thought entered his mind and offered him a crazy solution to his deadly problem. Knitting his brows together, He quickly focused on his spiritual energy and began to pump it into the palm of his outstretched hand. When the spikes came into his vision again, he knew he had gathered way too much of his energy. But that was intentional. Hado number 1. Show! He exclaimed and, from the palm of his hand, fired an extremely overloaded basic Hado that snapped few of his fingers in several different directions but also released a large wave of kinetic energy that demolished everything in its path while also slowing him down with the recoil. He was still falling at high speed but, because he fired the spell not that far away from the bottom of the abyss, his body was unable to accelerate to the previous speed. Gah! Like a sack of stones, he hit the ground painfully and far too rough to not receive injuries. He felt and heard several bones creaking in protest, his backside was killing him, he sported multiple small cuts but the worst was his calf. It was missing half of its original muscle mass and was bleeding quite heavily. Son of Aarg! He growled in pain and bit his lips in order to stay quiet. Damn, that hurts. If only I knew Kaido. Looking around himself with clenched teeth, he tried to study his surroundings to determine where he was but the pain was too sharp and so he glanced back at his leg and frowned deeply. In an act of random thinking, he pushed a big amount of spiritual energy into the wound in hope it could numb the pain. To his surprise, as soon as he did that, the muscle tissue along with the skin began to regrow at the rate that was clearly not humanly possible. Huh. I knew I could regenerate fast but this is, wait. Several similar instances of such regeneration came to his mind and a particular thought occurred to him. Is this, high-speed regeneration? He watched his calf muscle slowly gaining volume with a questioning gaze but then his eyes fell upon his Zanpakuto. Something in his mind clicked. Right, I'm part hollow. Makes sense. When the regeneration of the muscle ended, new skin began to envelop it and Ichigo nodded to himself with his lips pressed together in a sign of amazement. Neat. Since the pain was now bearable, he took the moment to glance around himself. The 4 hollows that had attacked him earlier were nowhere to be seen. Though when he glanced at the numerous sturdy spikes that he now realized were just tree-like structures he had seen before, he came to a conclusion that the hollows were most likely dead. Still, where the hell am I? He asked himself in an uncertain but also aggravated tone. Only thing he could see so far were the odd ashen tree structures and dark moving pillars. Wait a minute. Pillars don't move. He thought and squinted his eyes to see better. Then his spiritual sense sent him an alarming report of a myriad spiritual signatures scattered all around. The realization dawning upon him, he cursed under his breath. Damn it. Those are Minos Grande, the Julian-type hollows. When he tried to count all the signatures, he soon became aware that it was pointless to do so. It would take him minutes if not longer to finish. Not thinking twice, he lowered his Ryotsu to try and not attract attention. He could handle a few Minos, a dozen, or maybe even a bit more. I can't handle this much, though. I doubt even the commander could. It's like there are hundreds, thousands of them here. He licked his dry lips. It was kind of odd to know that there are 3 evolved types of hollows yet I couldn't see, hear, or feel any of those when I was above this abyss. Is this, perhaps, their hiding place? Why though? Or are these just a large group that decided to live underground? Not one of Academy books mentioned this. He thought and carefully moved from one shadow to another, using as little energy as he could. But luck didn't stay on his side for very long and, not even realizing it, he bumped into something that felt softer than the petrified trees. Hway! Ichigo jumped in surprise and quickly spun around, only to notice a large Minos Grande towering above him. The large hollow was staring right at him and Ichigo had to make a split-second decision. Crap. His body tensed in preparation to make a fast escape but he didn't move an inch. I know I shouldn't stay or else they'll all swarm me. The Minos began to slowly open its mouth and Ichigo clenched his teeth. There was something primal, something beastly emerging from within his consciousness and it caused his heart to beat faster. But I don't want to run. I want to fight. He mentally exclaimed and hurriedly unsheathed his Zanpakuto. When the creature started to gather energy around its mouth, he leaped in the air. Once he reached the peak of his jump, he pressed his feet against a tree branch behind him and shot even higher. When he was just above the hollow's head, he tightened the grip on the hilt of his sword and slashed downwards. The steel of his blade cut through the large masked head and, letting himself fall down, Ichigo kept it within the hollow's body. When his feet touched the ground, the Minos began to fall to both sides in an eerie squelch, his body vertically cleaved in two. It wasn't over though, as Ichigo spotted another Jillian that had been standing behind the first. Its mouth was already opened and there was bright energy already forming in front of it. With no time to lose, Ichigo raised his free hand and pointed his index finger at the creature. Hado number 1. Show. The kinetic energy produced from the spell hit the hollow right in its head and caused the energy to dissipate and the hollow to topple over. During its fall, Ichigo stuck his sword into its lower body and ran along it, matching the creature's falling speed with his steps. As soon as the large head hit the ground, he sliced upwards and caused his Zanpakuto to rip through the mask and to come out in the open. Something approached him from behind and Ichigo used his momentum to turn around and slashed. Just like a kitchen knife dipping into butter, his blade cleaned through the unsuspecting hollow before it realized it was dead. Blood spurted from the creature and splattered against a nearby tree. The corners of Ichigo's mouth curled upwards and he felt something within him waking up. Adrenaline spread through his body and his heart pumped blood in haste, almost like it was afraid. His pupils dilated slowly but steadily. In the darkness, he noticed slow movement and squinted his eyes to see better. A moment later, a row of Minos Grande came into the moonlight, with their mouth opened and bright red energy humming in front of them. Without hesitation, Ichigo raised his free hand and opened his palm. Sprinkled on the bones of the beast. Sharp tower, red crystal, steel ring. Move and become the wind, stop and become the calm. The sound of warring spears fills the empty castle. Hado number 63. Reikoho. He quickly chanted and, just as the hollows were about to release their attacks, a massive lightning strike shot from Ichigo's palm and crashed into them. A series of explosions reverberated through the area and Ichigo stared at the result of his spell with a satisfied grin. His Hado obliterated the whole group of hollows and opened up a path. However, the red energy the Jillians succeeded in gathering didn't just vanish like before and, instead, drilled holes in multiple trees and caused their large branches to fall down like harpoons. Ichigo struggled to maneuver through them unharmed but, once he did, he realized the consequences of his actions. Slowly turning around, he noted that dozens of Minos Grande were now aware of his presence and started to advance towards him in their typical, slow but loud fashion. The sound they made only further alerted more and more Jillians and Ichigo pressed his lips together. Then he stopped and formed a grin instead. Some of the Reishi from his dead opponents once again traveled towards the tip of his sword, but he no longer cared. Screw caution. It's time for some fun. He said and rested his Zanpakuto against his shoulder. For a few moments, he waited until the Minos closed some of the distance. But when he saw them opening their mouths, he acted. Chapter 32, Lion in the Lion's Den, Frontier of the Ancients. He leaped towards the first creature and sliced right through it. Paying the falling part of its body no mind, he landed on the ground, only to stab his next victim in its lower body. With a push, he slashed upwards and sent a shockwave through the rest of the creature's body. A bright beam of red energy hurried towards him but he reacted in time and tilted his whole body to the side. The Zero missed him only by a hair's breadth but the grin on his face remained. Turning towards the one who fired at him, he cocked back his free hand and sent into it a bit of his energy. Bakudo number 4. Hanawa. He exclaimed and a yellow energy in form of a rope dashed towards the Minos and wound around its body. With a grin that was slowly widening, Ichigo strained his muscles and pulled at the energy rope. The large hollows tried to resist but, with his feet digging into the soil, Ichigo accomplished his goal and smacked the creature against the hard surface of the ground. With a loud yell, he jumped on its head and stabbed through its mask all the way to the hilt of his Zanpakuto. Just as the creature's body began to turn into Reishi, he jumped down and tightened his grip on the cackling yellow rope of energy. Shifting all of his weight to one leg, he leaned backwards and pulled. With great effort, he lifted the slowly disappearing corpse and heaved it into a Minos in front of him. The impact threw the creature from its feet and it fell down on the another Minos behind it, soon creating a domino effect as multiple Minos Grande fell upon each other. Ichigo bared his teeth and flashed towards the fallen hollows. He no longer cared about keeping his riot solo and released it on his surroundings with pleasure. That's better, he thought, excited from the battle. Once he was nearing his fallen opponents, he leaped in the air and swung down his Zanpakuto that was brimming with a large amount of Ryuryoku. Getsuga Tensho. A terrifying crescent wave of energy came crashing down on the helpless Julians like a wave of tsunami, flushing their lives down the drain in one fell swoop and leaving a deep gash in the soil in form of a large claw mark. When Ichigo descended upon the hollow's remains, the creases around the gash were still burning with excess energy. He gave it a glance before turning and looking in the distance at the other Minos Grande. Eager to fight more of them, Ichigo's grin withered when he saw them moving in the opposite way, away from him. Hey! Come back here! His yell reverberated in the darkness like a bark of a dog, who just got his favorite toy taken away. With high expectations, he looked in all the other directions, but it looked like the full power of his Ryotsu caused the hollows to scurry away in fear of more punishment. For just a moment, Ichigo struggled to grasp the situation. From everything he knew so far, hollows always seemed like beasts with insatiable thirst that wouldn't stop trying to kill without a good reason. Then again, Grand Fisher tried to run away too. He thought when he recalled one of his few fights where he battled a sentient kind of a hollow. The memory brought with it some of the emotions he didn't want to relieve, and so he shook his head to get rid of them. But the damage was already done and his mood for fighting trickled away along with the last remnants of his Getsuga. He gave the scenery around him one more glance, to see if he was truly left alone, and when it was apparent that he was, he sighed, and aimed his sight at the hole through which he had fallen several minutes ago. I should get back up there, he thought, and his expression turned even sourer. The thought of abandoning the solid ground below his feet and returning to the endless sea of sand cracked his determination and forced him to sigh one more time. The question is, how? His eyes flickered to the numerous tree structures and their branches that reached almost all the way to the surface made of sand. Skeptical of their sturdiness, he formed a scowl. It was a long way up, and the sooner he climbed, the sooner he would get out. With that in mind, he took a few steps to the side so that the hole would be right above him and then fixated his sight at a nearby branch. Sheathing his Zanpakuto, he bent his knees and leaped in the air. His calculations proved to be good and he reached the branch without much trouble. When he landed, he tryingly raised his foot and strongly tapped the platform. His efforts left no cracks, and so he allowed himself to relax. His eyes darting around, he located the next branch. A few seconds later, he landed on it. He repeated the same process a few more times before suddenly stopping. There was an odd feeling, a strange itch, running down his spine. Immediately, he glanced down with narrowed eyes. But he saw and sensed nothing and no one. I swear I could feel somebody watching me. Strange. Giving the area below him one more glance, he turned his attention back to the task at hand and hopped to yet another branch. Step by step, jump by jump, he slowly reached the opening in the ground, and the first thing he noticed was the sand. He grimaced. But, having no other choice, he dashed through the hole and landed above it, on an unstable dune of sand. Cursing under his breath, he managed to recover his balance and peeked behind him. Almost fell back in. Ugh, thanks but no thanks. Just for fun, he kicked some of the sand into the abyss and then bounced forward, once again going in the right direction. The hole in the ground was long behind him before something crossed his mind. It was another one of those thoughts that brought an indescribable feeling in Ichigo's consciousness. That kind of feeling that came and went away, leaving nothing but an elusive tickle running down his spine. Why do I feel like this wasn't the first time I visited that underground area? However, his question remained unanswered. As much as he frowned and tried to sort out his memories, there wasn't anything within them that could satisfyingly explain the ghost feeling of déjà vu. And so, he did what he had always done in such occasions. He shook his head and let go. By the time he made another stop, he was already thinking about different things. Mainly, about something that stood in the vast sands of Hueco Mundo like a sore thumb. It was something that was mind-boggling and caused him to stare at it in utter shock. Are those ruins? He asked with eyes bugged out and mouth hanging open. There, in a distance, were remnants of something that most likely had been a settlement for intelligent beings. After he closed his mouth, he quickly dashed towards the dilapidated structures and reached for the closest one with his left hand. As soon as he made contact, he jumped away in surprise. What was that? He muttered and glanced at his hand. It was tingling, almost as if electricity pulsed straight through it. Momentarily unable to comprehend the situation, he shook the hand and then rubbed it with the other one. As he did so, he cast a slow and searching gaze upon the whole area that was filled with similar fragments of walls from the past. These are definitely man-made. It's not natural, he stated, and took a closer look at the piece of wall that had just shocked him. Turning his head from side to side, he observed the surface of the wall with a deeply concentrated frown. Yeah, this is a worked stone, though I have no idea what it's called. But it must be pretty old. I remember seeing similar stuff in history books. Throwing a brief look at the palm of his left hand, he closed it into a fist and, after a second, opened it. He took a deep breath and carefully placed it at the surface of the wall. This time, he received no shock. The only thing he felt was the cold, rough stone. This is crazy, he muttered and then straightened his back. Nibbling on his lower lip, he withdrew his left hand and used it to scratch his head. What is this place? I really doubt this is a work of Hollows. It can't be. And what was that? He grunted and reflexively rubbed his left hand against the side of his thigh. It was no longer tingling, but the sensation of being touched by something unknown remained. Curious, he wandered through the ruins in hope of finding something that would shine some light upon the mystery. He inspected the wall fragments, searched the small crevices between the debris, but no matter how hard he explored the area, there was nothing new to be found. Still, he was unable to stop himself from doing it. Similar to the underground area filled with Minos Grande, the ruins were giving off the vibe of a place he had visited sometime in the past. His suspicions were confirmed when his inner spirit called out to him. I can feel it too, Ichigo. There's something truly familiar in here. Yet I cannot explain it with mere words. It's like I was once here as well. Ichigo listened to the spirit and quietly hummed to himself. Makes sense. After all, you are a part of me. No, Ichigo. I meant me as my real self. Like walking into an invisible wall, Ichigo immediately stopped moving and his eyebrows shot upwards. I am not sure, Ichigo. But this place brings back emotions I don't recognize, feelings I don't comprehend. Hearing the distress in his spirit's voice confused and shocked Ichigo more than he was willing to admit. Instead of trying to ask more questions, he decided to search his own memories, but, just as with the underground area full of Minos Grande, he came up with empty hands. Creasing his brow, he sat on one of the smaller pieces of stone and let his feet dangle along it. What's really weird, is that no matter what, I feel so relaxed like I haven't for a very long time, and I don't think it's because my feet aren't covered in sand. It must be because of this place. There's something calming about it. I feel like I could just close my eyes and sleep. I feel like I could do anything I want. He whispered. Well, it is no longer raining in here and the skyscrapers are rebuilding themselves faster than before, so something is definitely different, Ichigo. Ichigo leaned backwards and briefly closed his eyes. Truly, it had been a while since he felt so at ease. With the moonlight showering him with its soft touch, it felt just like paradise. Serene and peaceful, for just a short moment, it became Ichigo's little piece of heaven. It was almost as if his mother caressed his face, taking all of his worries and throwing them away, to a place from which they couldn't return to haunt him. As the tranquility of the place spread through his body, he let go of the hold on his spiritual energy and allowed it to flow out of him like a brooklet, trickling through the stones and sand with a calming hum. It flowed out and stretched across all corners of the ruins and helped him achieve a peace of mind, where he could feel every single grain of sand and brush it softly with the breeze of his mind. Very slowly, as if in trance, he opened his eyes and stared at the night sky, at the inverted crescent moon standing proud above him, with a glazed gaze. The whole area around him became a sea of hope and misery, of black and white and light and dark. Duality of the emotions hidden deep within him flowed right above the ground and, every so often, it patted the sand with a motherly touch, long gone and forgotten. Bit by bit, the air itself became filled with light as sand around Ichigo changed its nature and turned into spirit particles, causing a light blue glow to illuminate everything around his vicinity. An ocean of Reishi, the light rose from the ground and danced chaotically, in an unpredictable pattern, and then started to fall down and shower Ichigo with its glow. Ichigo! Stop! Ichigo's eyes regained their life and the teen released a breath he didn't know he had been keeping in. Surprised by the sudden abundance of light, he frantically looked around himself, to see the Reishi slowly turning back into grains of sand and then raining upon the ground. Feeling lightheaded, Ichigo lightly shook his head and rubbed his eyes. What happened? A series of flashing images, a scenery of past few minutes, flowed into his mind and briefly incapacitated him. I don't know how, but you just tried to do something very advanced that you should not be able to do. It's called domination of Reishi and it is the strongest technique a Quincy can develop. In awe, Ichigo quickly got over the new memories and opened his mouth, but before he could say even a word, his inner spirit continued. Yes, you'd think it is a good thing, but I have to warn you, Ichigo. This technique isn't something you can power your way through, and attempting to use it before you are ready can tear your body and soul apart. It is a very rare ability. For now, simply forget about it. For a few seconds, Ichigo unwillingly imitated a fish on a dry land, but when he realized he had no arguments, he simply sighed. I could try the basics, though, right? His inner spirit sent him an image of a friendly smile. Yes. For whatever reason it may be, it seems this place amplifies your ability to manipulate spiritual particles. Give it a go, but don't overdo it, Ichigo. Right. Sometime later, Ichigo leaned into a larger ruin of a wall with a satisfied smile. He felt sweaty and mentally drained, but also happy with his progress. Well, I finally did something. It was just a little bit, but now I have a better grasp on the technique itself. I probably won't use it in battle anytime soon, but, well, I am glad I tried. He breathed out. Content with himself, he was about to close his eyes and rest for a bit, but his sixth sense suddenly went haywire and made him jump back on his feet. He tensed and looked in the distance. The same feeling of being watched he had experienced when climbing out of the underground area creeped up on his spine. Whoever you are, come out! He yelled. For a second, nothing happened and he thought that once again, he was just imaging things, but then something slowly appeared in his vision. Squinting, he tried to make out the outline and realized it was just a hollow. He lazily reached for the hilt of his Zanpakuto when a large Ryutsu hit his shoulders. You are not him, yet you possess some of his spiritual energy. You are a Shinigami, yet there is a hollow tint in you. His tint. A voice, carried by the wind, entered his ears. The hollow began to reduce the distance between them. Ichigo still couldn't see him properly, but he could at least deduce the creature's size. Great, a talkative hollow. He muttered. But he can't be just a regular hollow. This pressure is stronger than the one of Minos Grande. And he is most likely as big as the ones I remember from the books. Anagichus. He added mentally and narrowed his eyes. And you seem not to remember me. Is it mockery? When the hollow finally came close enough, Ichigo noticed few details but didn't dare to spend more time on studying the creature's body. This is the first time I meet a hollow that evolved from Minos Grande. What is he talking about? The hollow stopped moving and seemingly pointed one of its large hands towards a horrible scar on its chest. See this? A memento of our fight. I kept it. I kept it in case I meet you again, so I'd have motivation to kill you. Still confused, Ichigo didn't want to underestimate his opponent, and so he quickly unsheathed his Zanpakuto and raised it in front of himself. The hollow's face twisted into a terrifying grin, but the creature didn't move from his spot. I am the guardian of the forest of Minos. I have survived countless encounters with Shinigami and hollows alike. Do you know why? Because I have the ability to learn from my mistakes. And I did. I learned from my last mistake. What was my last mistake? Not enough support. Once the hollow, the guardian, shouted, 3 additional hollows of the same size as he was, jumped from behind him and landed in front of Ichigo, strategically positioned so he had no way of escaping. Seeing that, Ichigo mentally cursed. Shit. I didn't notice them, and judging by their Ryotsu, they are most likely Ajichas as well. Attack him. This is not good. Just as the three Ajichas leaped towards him, Ichigo released a good amount of energy and poured it into his Zanpakuto. Bleach their souls, Zanjutsu. Getchuga Tensho. He activated his Shikai and immediately after let out a moderate wave of energy that crashed into one of the hollows, while the other two that managed to get out of the way landed on both his sides and swiped at him with long, large claws. Surprised at the mobility of the creatures, Ichigo barely managed to raise both his swords in defense. While the larger one completely blocked the claw, the smaller one didn't, and Ichigo received 2 gashes in his left side and 1 in his left shoulder. Gh. He felt several droplets of blood leaving his body and couldn't help but grunt in pain. Straining his muscles, he shifted his weight to the right side and pushed one hollow away. As he did so, he raised his left hand and pointed an index finger at the other hollow that was trying to gnaw at him. Heido number 1. Show. In that moment, the third hollow reappeared in front of his face with a deep gash that ran from one side of his abdomen to the other. Before Ichigo could bring his swords together, the hollow's thick leg made contact with his body and he felt his feet leaving the ground. Gah! Spitting everywhere, Ichigo crashed into a large boulder and caused it to crack. He had no time to completely recover though, as the hollow he had pushed to the side came at him again with its claw. In the last moment, Ichigo gathered a large amount of Ryuryoku and expelled it from his body. Doing so prevented the hollow from reaching him but also cost him quite a bit from his energy reserves. Come on, Ichigo. Move. Mentally goading himself, he gritted his teeth and rolled away from the boulder, just in time to evade the hollow's renewed attack. You are weak in your Shinigami form. Turn into hollow. I want to kill the real you. Ichigo heard the guardians yell and felt anger quietly bubbling within his mind and body. With a growl, he flipped backwards and evaded another attack from a side. Quickly assessing the situation, he slashed the air in front of him with his smaller blade. Getchuga Tensho. The blast from the smaller sword came out different than his previous blast and confused the hollow he aimed it at enough for the blast to hit him straight in its legs. The hollow fell on the ground, his legs roughly blasted away, and screamed in agony. I should finish him while he's down, but I'm sure as hell these two won't let me. Ichigo ignored him and switched his focus to the remaining two. He did it just in time to see a large claw descending on him. Seeing the second hollow not yet in the striking distance, he pumped his legs full of Ryuryoku and flashed away. The claw hit the sand with a loud noise and blasted it everywhere. That provided Ichigo with enough distraction to circle around and slash the second hollow from behind, but the creature proved to be fast and evaded the strike while receiving only not life-threatening gash to its side. Scowling, Ichigo spun around. He expected an attack from behind and he wasn't wrong. Before the hollow realized it, Ichigo blocked him with his larger sword and followed it with a slash with the smaller one. The creature's abdomen opened and several contents spilled on the ground. Ichigo barely noticed it when something rammed into him with the power of a tank and smashed him against nearby remnants of a wall. Pain attacked him from every direction and he could hear his bones scream in protest. I almost forgot this one, he already regenerated. Quickly, he spread his Ryuryoku across his whole body and hoped his own regeneration would keep him on his feet. However, he was still pinned down and so he redirected some of that energy into the palm of his hand. Crushed beneath the hollow, he managed to get one arm free and pushed his opened palm against the creature's side. Heido number 63. Reikoho. Despite not using an incantation, from this distance the spell held enough power to completely smash through the hollow's left side and escape through the other, leaving nothing but a gaping hole in its wake. Before the creature fell on him, barely conscious, Ichigo rolled away while keeping a tight grip on his swords. As he rolled, he sliced through the remnants of the hollow's abdomen and completely severed its lower part from its upper part. That's one down. But the mild satisfaction lasted only until something heavy smashed into his side and knocked the breath out of him. The power behind the strike lifted his body and sent him spiraling through the air. Coughing and trying to find his balance, Ichigo saw something red in the corners of his vision, and when he crashed into sand, he heard a loud rumbling sound approaching him fast. Without even raising his head, he knew what it was. Zero. Mentally screaming at his body to move, he found some strength in his legs and threw himself away. Incredibly lucky, he avoided receiving a direct hit, but the following explosion swallowed him whole. Turn into a hollow. Do it. Just do it. As the smoke around him cleared, Ichigo gasped for breath and tried not to look at the state of his body. He could feel the burns and bruises and the pain was wearing him down. Yet the persistent yells of the Guardian fueled his anger and didn't allow him to surrender. He snarled like a beast and pushed himself off the ground. Through the remnants of the smoke, he shot forward and brought his Zanpakuto down just as one of the remaining hollows tried to deliver a finishing strike. Fuck you. Helping himself with a shout, he held back nothing and the blades of his swords cut through the hollow's skin, muscles, and bones at the same time and severed one of its arms at the elbow and one of its legs at the knee. Gyaaya! The hollow screamed in pain and spurted a large amount of blood all over Ichigo's chest and face. But Ichigo ignored it. Moving fast, he slashed the air on his left and released a bright blast at the other hollow that tried to circle around him. The attack pushed the creature away and allowed him to focus his anger at the monster he had just wounded. He saw it trying to swat him away with its remaining arm, but he didn't let it. Bending his knees, he vaulted over his fallen opponent and plunged his large sword right into its head. There was a brief struggle of gurgling sounds, but the hollow's limbs eventually slumped down. That's 2 down. Ichigo raised his head and glanced at the one last hollow watching him from a nearby spot. When he slowly plucked his blade from the slowly disintegrating corpse, the creature suddenly seemed not as confident as it did just mere seconds before. To his surprise, Ichigo realized he didn't really care for the hollow's intentions. A battle offered no room for compassion. Leaning slightly forward, Ichigo charged the creature with both swords at the ready. He was forced to hastily duck under a far-reaching swipe and brought his Zanpakuto close to block a following swing of the creature's massive tail. His feet dug into the sand and he felt himself being pushed a bit back, but he withstood the strike without much other problems. When the pressure subsided, he leaped in the air. Despite its size, the hollow acted fast and jumped as well, but Ichigo was faster. He redirected the clawed arm with one sword while sinking his other sword in the creature's unguarded chest. Expecting an angry response, he ducked under a swipe but kept the grip on the sword embedded in the hollow's body and pushed it downwards. The creature guts became exposed to the chilly air of Hueco Mundo and caused the hollow to scream. It dropped down and hit the sand dune with Ichigo on its tail. He wasn't about to give his opponent any time to recover and with one clean swipe severed the creature's head from the rest of its body. That's 3 down. Scowling, he looked up and aimed his sight at the only other hollow in his vicinity, the Guardian. That's the last one. The Guardian of the Forest of Minos met his gaze with an expression that was hard to tell through his mask. Though Ichigo was sure of at least one thing. The spiritual pressure of the hollow had been steadily rising throughout the whole fight, and it seemed it had reached its peak, which must have meant 2 things. The current Ryotsu was the hollow's maximum. The hollow's maximum Ryotsu was stronger than he had hoped for. If he tried to compare it with the 3 Ajichas he had just defeated, Ichigo was sure it was stronger than any of them. It was not as much as all of them combined, but it was still quite powerful. At the same time, it was inferior to the one Ichigo himself possessed. Still, that means jack shit. Hisagi-san's Ryotsu is weaker as well, yet his Zanjutsu more than makes up for it. I need to be careful here. Ichigo thought to himself, but looking at the hollow standing opposite of him, he could feel his caution dropping in favor of combat brutality. Finally, he could fight 1 versus 1 without any interruption and against somebody of his own level. It was hard to admit, but Ichigo knew he longed for such a fight ever since he had received the brutal beatdown at hands of a certain pale, black-haired hollow who wore white clothes and had the same attitude Ichigo had just a few months ago. So, you refuse to turn? That will be your funeral, Shinigami. Ichigo hardened his gaze and let his hollow Ryuryoku form a small fragment of his hollow mask. It covered his nose and the curvature between it and his eyebrows. He could still safely add a bit more, but, for the moment, he wanted to keep that as a secret card. I see, so you refuse to speak. Instead, you mock me with this joke. Die. The Guardian briefly vanished from his vision, but he was ready. Spreading Ryuryoku evenly across his body, he pushed himself off the ground and vanished as well. Buzzing sound of hollows sonido echoed in the air and seemingly fought against the noise from Ichigo's shunpo. The 2 combatants moved across the battlefield in high speed, meeting only to trade blows that both either blocked or parried. But a stalemate wasn't an option. When he sped towards the Guardian in a straight line, the Hollow's whip-like tail shot at him like a bullet and forced him to rethink his next step. With one leg forward, he shifted his weight to it and sprang in the air. Barely avoiding getting hit, he found himself right above the tip of the tail and an idea struck him from nowhere. He raised one hand and poured Ryuryoku into it. Bakudo number 4. Hainawa. A crackling yellow energy in form of a rope formed in his palm and, with a flick of a wrist, he threw it on the tail below him. The rope wound around it, and when it did, Ichigo pulled at it. Sharply snapping his hand to the side, he strained his arm and dragged the surprised Hollow across the sand by its tail and smashed him into the same boulder he had crashed into during his fight against other Ajichas. Already cracked, the stone couldn't withstand another direct blow and exploded in a shower of dust and stone debris. Ichigo quickly dispelled the Kido and was about to land when he heard the familiar rumbling noise coming straight at him. In the last moment, he awkwardly hopped using only his toes and watched the red beam of energy pass below him. Then he fell down, face first, and felt sand entering his mouth. With the speed of a sand snake, he rolled over while spitting the dirt and saw several long appendages coming at him from above. Oh crap! Acting even faster than before, he pulled his legs up to his chest and put his hands on the ground, next to his ears. Shifting all of his weight to his shoulders, he kicked up and pushed hard with his hands as soon as he felt the momentum going upwards. In a split second, he landed back on his feet and immediately severed one of the Hollow's appendages that got way too close to hitting his face. However, there were several others that were quickly shortening the distance and he was forced to leap backwards. There's way too many of them, he mentally noted, and as he sailed through the air, slashed his large sword down while letting off a large blast of energy. Getsuga Tensho. He could see his attack severing many stubborn appendages, but because of it, he didn't notice the Hollow's tail coming at him from the side. It hit him right in his right thigh and tore deep into his flesh. Blood spurted from the gash and broke some of his concentration with the sharp pain that quickly followed after. Bastard. He groaned and let his eyes dart around the area in an attempt to locate his opponent. When he did, he let out a quiet, angry growl. Found you. While his leg regenerated, he followed the Guardian's trajectory with his eyes, and when the Hollow came close enough, he raised his hand with a bright orb of energy already forming around it. Heido number 63. Reikoho. The powerful lightning strike traveled through the air too fast for the Hollow to dodge and stopped him right in his track. The power behind the spell immediately overpowered the creature's momentum and blasted him back, where he smashed into a sand dune with a dull sound of a large rock hitting the ground at high speed. Ichigo let out a puff of air and felt that he was beginning to tire. I sustained quite a lot of blows and injuries, I should have rested more before going here. Though I guess I didn't have much choice. He mentally noted and renewed the grip on his Zanpakuto. The fight was still not over and he knew it. Keeping his stamina in mind, he flashed towards the spot where he saw the Guardian land and saw the Hollow slowly getting back up. In return, the Hollow noticed him coming and plunged its tail into the ground, causing Ichigo to narrow his eyes in suspicion. All of a sudden, the tail shot from the ground right below him and pierced through his other leg and almost through his chin as well. In the last second, Ichigo cocked his head back and watched the tip of the tail stop in front of his eyes. With a squelch, the Hollow withdrew the tail and Ichigo barely remained standing. His right thigh had still not yet recovered and now even his other leg got injured. Maybe you aren't as bad as a Shinigami too, but I am the Guardian of the Forest of Minos. The most powerful Hollow of that place. You are a century too inexperienced to defeat me. Pushing his eyes towards the back of his head, Ichigo was starting to feel his anger getting replaced with irritation. A bit more of his Hollow Ryuryoku seeped out of him through his wounds and joined with the fragment of his mask, making it a bit more complete. A small surge of power ran across his body and he smacked both his legs. I think I heard similar words from another Hollow before. Want to know what happened? He hissed at the Hollow, whose eyes narrowed. I survived. The Hollow didn't. He added and flashed towards the Hollow with his Zanpakuto raised high. His sword sliced through the air but hit only the ground full of sand. The creature must have sensed his intentions and hastily moved away from the spot. Then he heard the rumbling noise coming at him from behind once again, and he quickly turned around with his Zanpakuto already rising and brimming with incredible amount of Ryuryoku. Getsuga Tensho. With a shout, he released the biggest wave of energy he could and watched it smash right through the Guardian's Zero with overwhelming power. The red beam stood no chance, and Ichigo's blast almost completely erased it from existence, continuing further, towards the stunned Hollow, who had no way of escaping it. The Getsuga rammed into him like a hurricane and tore him apart like he was just a porcelain doll. The Guardian encountered death before he could utter a single word or scream in pain. In the wake of the blast, grains of sand turned into Reishi and glowed in the gloom of Hueco Mundo as a remainder of a terrifying power of one Kurosaki Ichigo. The person himself felt his legs shake and he fell on his knees, feeling drained physically and mentally alike. Well, that's that. I should have done that from the beginning. Me and my thirst for a good battle. It's almost like I'm turning into Kenpeki. He wheezed and mentally applauded as well as berated himself. He defeated a strong opponent by himself without resorting to using more of his hollow power than he should. However, as he took deep breaths, an awful feeling assaulted his senses and made him look up and glance at his surroundings. Come on! From all around him, a horde of hollows was closing in on him, screaming, yelling and shrieking in their beastly voices. If Ichigo thought killing the Guardian of the Forest of Minos would have triggered their survival instinct and caused them to run away from him with their tails tucked between their legs, the truth was the opposite. Unlike Minos Grande, regular hollows clearly held different values. Or maybe they are just insane. Ichigo thought and clenched his jaw. Either way, he was in trouble. While still far from being out of breath, he knew that decimating the whole mob of hollows, were they just regular hollows or evolved ones, would take away a lot of his energy he still needed for other things. Nevertheless, he still pushed himself off the ground and raised both his swords. Giving the horde of hollows a dirty stare, he formed a deep scowl. Who's next? It was hours later that he was leaning into his large sword, sweaty and tired, but victorious. All around him, countless hollow corpses slowly turned into Reishi, creating a large beacon of blue light and revealing his smug grin. Heh, bunch of trash, he said. When he felt his legs slowly giving away, he dragged himself next to a small ruined wall and sat at its base while letting his back touching it. From afar, he felt another wave of hollow spiritual energy approaching and he smacked his head against the sturdy surface of the wall. Looking at the moon sky, he released a deep sigh. This is going exactly as I didn't want it to. In that moment, the wave of hollow spiritual energy vanished and was replaced with a monstrous riot so that almost pushed him deeper into the sand. Seems like you are in quite the pinch, Kurosaki Ichigo. Perhaps you need an assistance. Ichigo didn't even have to look at the owner of the voice to know who it was. There was only one person whose riot so was that large and whose voice could get under one's skin so much. Allowing himself a short snort, Ichigo shook his head and formed a small smile. Aizen, yes, perhaps. Chapter 33, White Lies of the God, Sinful Blades. Little bit later, a tired Ichigo walked along Aizen as the latter led him towards his place in Hueco Mundo, where he offered Ichigo a place to rest. Since Ichigo didn't want to waste any more energy that he already had, he wasn't keen on talking and so the only one who spoke was the former captain. I am quite curious, Kurosaki. Did you decide on some sort of mission to eradicate all hollows in Hueco Mundo? You did slay quite a lot of them. However, Ichigo felt like he didn't want to spend the next few hours just listening and so he decided to ever so often offer a response. I had nowhere else to go. From the corners of his eyes, he could see Aizen tilting his head towards him in a slightly confused manner. For a few seconds, the man seemed to just stare at him with a studying gaze. Then he turned away. I find that hard to believe, Kurosaki. You are a very important person for the Godai 13. Ichigo snorted. You mean a tool or an asset, not a person? Quite. Godai is a military organization, after all. It may feel a lot more humane than it was decades, centuries ago, but at its core, it is still an establishment created for the purpose of fighting wars and battles. You may be whoever you are, Kurosaki, but in the eyes of Godai, you will be a soldier first, person later. Always. Aizen said in a bit more serious tone than before, causing Ichigo to squint at him with eyes full of disbelief. "And who am I?" Aizen chuckled. "Only you yourself know the answer to that, Kurosaki. I'd say you are a person who definitely should have a place to go." One of Ichigo's eyebrows rose and he threw a glance at Aizen to see a smooth smile hovering on the man's mouth. It was the type of smile one had when facing somebody who was obviously trying to avoid telling the truth, and Ichigo realized it a second later. He formed a frown and cast his eyes down. "I was about to be punished for misbehavior, and the punishment was to let the captain of the 12th Division experiment on me. Suffice to say, bullshit. There's no way I'm letting that crazy bastard anywhere near me," he said slowly and formed a fist with his left hand, so that Aizen could see it. In response, Aizen hummed quietly and nodded to himself. Misbehavior, is that how they call turning into a hollow nowadays? When Ichigo turned his head and gave him a searching stare, Aizen dismissively waved with his hand. "Oh, please. We both know I know. There's no need to obscure the truth," Aizen said, and then, for a short moment, he moved his eyebrows close together and went silent. Ichigo watched him from the corner of his eye and remained silent. "I see. So, the commander remains a fool and tries to uphold the obsolete laws that shouldn't be taken at face value. Interesting. So, you traveled to Hueco Mundo in order to escape his reach? Is this your way of telling me you finally decided to see the truth and accept my original offer? It still holds true, by the way." Aizen finally spoke and turned his whole body to look Ichigo straight in the eyes. The teen tensed but knew that such a question would eventually come. It was inevitable. He knew what he was supposed to say, but his stomach shook and a small bead of sweat formed on the side of his face. Licking his suddenly dry lips, he opened his mouth. "Well, of course not. I lied about everything and I'm actually here on a mission to assassinate you," he said in what he considered to be a firm voice. Aizen's eyebrows shot high and he stared at Ichigo in surprise, clearly not expecting such an answer. Soon after that, though, a small smile began to play on his lips. Once it appeared, it quickly spread across his whole face and he chuckled wholeheartedly. "Haha. Superb answer, Kurosaki Ichigo. Does that mean I should just kill you here on the spot?" Nervously chuckling with him, Ichigo felt a shiver running down his spine and fought the urge to immediately flee. During a split second that Aizen's laugh caused the man to look away, he gulped. He moved one hand towards the hilt of his Zanpakuto, and when he saw Aizen catching a glimpse of that, he provocatively patted the sword. "I wouldn't go down without a fight, though." Aizen stopped laughing, but a wide grin remained on his face. The man nodded to Ichigo. "No, I suppose not. Very well, Kurosaki, I guess I should take your attempt at humoring me for a positive answer." Ichigo nodded and his expression changed to a serious frown. Seeing that, Aizen did the same. "It's not like I have any other option, Aizen. Don't make any mistake, I still despise you for many different things. It's just that being on my own is equal to a suicide, and, before I could pick a side, a decision was made for me," Ichigo said roughly and turned his head away from Aizen. Instead he looked in the distance. Because of that, he couldn't see Aizen's facial expression. "Is your hatred connected to that Kazumi girl, Kurosaki?" Ichigo's hand shook and he almost tripped on a sand dune from the shock. He forced himself not to immediately snap and settled for a tiny growl. Without looking at the man walking next to him, he hissed. "What do you think?" There was barely any pause before Aizen offered him a reply. "I think it does, and so I think I should start correcting our relationship by telling you the truth." Ichigo's head snapped to the side and gave Aizen a piercing gaze. "What the hell do you mean?" He watched Aizen's face seemingly drop any hint of its usual pompousness, and the man settled for a neutral expression. "I know it may come to you as a shock, seeing as you are not used to Shinigami telling you the truth, but here, in Hueco Mundo, I will be telling you the truth. For example, the Kazumi girl. True, I didn't care for her in a way I care for others. I'm not a saint and I will never pretend to be. To achieve my goals, I have sacrificed and I will continue to sacrifice much, Kurosaki. However, in this particular case, I recruited the girl only because I thought she could help you," the man said, and Ichigo fought against every fiber of his body that was telling him to just sack Aizen in the face. You're treading on thin ice, Aizen. He muttered with a sharp edge in his voice. Aizen simply nodded. I will not pretend I did it out of the care for your personal well-being because I didn't. Until you came to Siridi, I thought of you as something I could use to achieve my goals. Now I see you as much more. That's why I'm telling you all this. Moving on. I thought she could help you survive and shape your personality. I didn't give her any orders, aside from the one that she should spy on you. I did that only to keep track on your progress, to know whether you can become useful or not. Unfortunately, I did not foresee that your hatred towards Shinigami could become that strong and that you and the girl would develop a deeper bond. In the end, it still went as I wanted it, but not quite as planned. The man continued until Ichigo stopped moving and hastily took out his Zanpakuto, only to repeatedly stab it in the ground with so much power, the grains of sand rose in the air and briefly obscured the teen. After a moment, Ichigo stopped and, breathing heavily, he leaned into his sword, embedded in the ground. You still had your fingers in her death. She could live if not for those damn Ryotsu masking cloaks. I could have saved her. There was a brief moment of silence, during which only Ichigo's heavy breathing could be heard. With his eyes pointed at the sand around the blade of his sword, Ichigo couldn't see Aizen. So could Yuryu Shihoin, yet she did not. Besides, I did not supply any cloaks to whoever you are implying. I do have similar ones, but mine can do more than just mask Ryotsu. You are thinking of cloaks designed by Urahara Kisuke. He left the design blueprint for them in Shinigami Research and Development Institute, where many from the 12th Division have an access to it, and, I think I already told you this, things from the 12th Division have the tendency to appear at Rukonga's black market from time to time. There was a slight chill seeping from Aizen's words, but Ichigo didn't notice it. He focused his attention to a different detail. The one about the black market. Feeling anger rising within him, his face twisted into a grimace that was similar to the one of disgust, but was actually fueled by desperation. In one swift movement, he plucked his Zanpakuto from the ground and released a wordless Getsuga at the sky. Then he fell on his knees. If that's really the truth. Ichigo breathed and glanced at Aizen with a desperate look. Aizen returned his gaze without flinching. You are free to doubt my words, Kurosaki. I won't hold it against you. Just think about it. Up until the very last moments before my defection, I mostly only watched you from the shadows. Aside from the Kazumi girl, I barely interfered with your life directly. I wanted you to grow by yourself, make your own mistakes and learn from them so you could grow strong. It was others who interfered directly and hid the truth from you, obscured it with petty lies and sweet words. The man said. The words hit Ichigo. They pierced right through his body and mind. Just as he remembered, it was hard to argue with Aizen. The man had an incredible capacity for twisting the words and telling them either with brutal honesty, or shrouding them in a cloud of uncertainty. However, a small, stray thought entered Ichigo's mind and began to nibble on his consciousness. Can he be actually telling the truth? Obviously, I can't just trust him, but what if Aizen truly isn't the real villain of this story? Is it possible all of it is just a mixture of weird coincidences? It can't be, right? Come, Kurosaki. There is still a long way to go. I will tell you more on our way. Ichigo listened to him and slowly got back on his feet. He didn't trust Aizen, that much didn't change. But there were definitely seeds of doubt planted deep within his mind, and it was just a question of time whether they would bloom and grow, or dry up and wither. For now, he decided to just go with the flow. There was enough time to make hard decisions. Until then, he had a mission. It was quite a bit later when a construct of some kind appeared at the very edge of his vision, far in the distance. When he looked at Aizen with a questioning gaze, the man nodded. Yes, that is indeed our destination. Our fortress. I call it Las Noches. When Ichigo turned away from Aizen and looked back at the very slowly growing fortress, he heard Aizen continued speaking. There's one more thing you should know, Kurosaki. Do you know why I played the sweet, caring captain back in Siridi? Why I posed as a trustworthy and friendly man whom almost everyone loved? No. Ichigo noticed Aizen's features changing ever so slightly, though it may have been just an illusion. When you uncover the most guarded secrets and dirt of a place you thought to be perfect, when you break through the illusion and find the deception everywhere you look, when everything you thought to be real becomes a fabrication of the past sins, the only way to survive is to keep your worst enemies as close as you can. Be careful, Kurosaki, as the time when you'll realize the truth is coming. Narrowing his eyes, Ichigo's eyes darted back to the image of the large building in the distance and he felt apprehensive. There are times when his choice of words alone makes me want to bang my head against the wall. He's just as cryptic as Urahara Kisuke and the others, yet somehow I feel there might be truth hidden in him. Maybe he just believes so much in his version that to him, it actually becomes the truth. I don't know. I wish Zanjitsu was here to tell me his opinion. Deep within his psyche, a voice whispered without Ichigo hearing it. Be careful, Ichigo. That was the most important and the biggest truth he told you so far. Don't fall for his truth, but, at the same time, do not be deaf to it. The real truth is hidden everywhere around you. You just have to find it yourself. Once they were standing right in front of the entrance to the Las Noches, Ichigo realized the sheer absurdity that was its size. It took them hours from the point where they had first spotted the structure to actually reach its walls, so thinking about it logically, Ichigo knew the fortress was humongous. But, as they passed through the entrance, he understood just how much he had underestimated its size. If there was anything he could compare Las Noches to in size, it was the entirety of Siridi. Huh. He blinked in surprise when sunlight suddenly assaulted his eyes and forced him to lower his head to try and shield himself from it. Time spent in gloom Hueco Mundo took its toll and he wasn't accustomed to such intense light. Then it hit him. Wait, why is there a sunlight? Still squinting hard, he carefully glanced up only to see bright blue of the sky, snow white, tiny clouds and a blinding sun. It was so bright, even the sand that was still all around them stopped looking as irritating as it had before. No sense in living in eternal night when you have the technology to change it. Aizen quipped and then pointed his hand towards a collection of several large buildings that seemed to be situated in the middle of Las Noches. Still in awe, Ichigo followed his line of sight and nodded in understatement. However, due to the sheer size of the Las Noches area, it took them so long to reach their final destination that by the time they finally got to the entrance of the central structure, Ichigo had already lost the sense of time. Inside, Aizen led him through great number of rooms, halls, staircases and spacious corridors, until they reached large doors at what seemed to be the upper part of the structure. There, Aizen stopped walking and looked back at him. Behind these doors, you will meet my best troops I like to call the Espada. While you live here, I hope you can learn to get along with them. You expected me to come with you, didn't you? Aizen just smiled. Given your situation, I expected you to use your brain, Kurosaki. I'm glad I was not wrong. He stated and the doors in front of them opened. Immediately, Ichigo's senses were assaulted from every direction with a multitude of several different spiritual signatures that ranged from quite normal to quite extraordinary. Though still nothing in comparison with Aizen. He mentally noted, and when Aizen stepped inside the room, he followed after him. My Espada, I present you our newest guest, Kurosaki Ichigo. Stepping from Aizen's shadow, Ichigo was finally met with the sight of a large table and 10 beings who, more or less, looked just like regular humans sitting at it. They all stared at him in surprise that ranged from barely existent to barely contained. Ichigo immediately recognized 2 of them. Ulquiorra and, if I recall correctly, Yami. Unintentionally, when his eyes passed the former, Ichigo's Ryotsu flared a bit. PCHE, it's that trash. I thought he died. How about it? Want a rematch, Shinigami? Ichigo, along with the rest, looked towards the owner of the voice, the one he identified as Yami, and narrowed his eyes. Before Aizen could stop him, he spoke to the hollow. No. Ha. Afraid to lose? Yes. When Ichigo uttered the unexpected answer, all of the Espada glanced at him with varying degree of confusion. Even Yami himself seemed to be dumbfounded. Not even Aizen was able to hide his surprise. But the man quickly masked it with a smile. Now, before we can get to friendly bicker, it would be polite to introduce you. Kurosaki, going by my Espada's given numbers, these are, Aizen said and pointed his hand towards Yami. Yami Largo, currently the Diaz Espada. Then he pointed at another one, whose appearance seemed different from the rest, as his body looked just like human yet the head had large, cylindrical shape, completely inhuman. Araniro Aruruari, the Noveno Espada. Unlike Yemi, who ignored his introduction, Araniro politely nodded to Ichigo, who felt the need to return the gesture. Aizen's hand moved and pointed at the next Espada. Sailaporo Grands, the Octava Espada. At first glance, Ichigo immediately decided he didn't like that one. Sailaporo was a thin male with shoulder-length pink hair, remnants of his hollow mask in form of glasses and a far too smug grin plastered all across his face. While being introduced, Sailaporo simply widened said grin. Zamariruros, the Septima Espada. Next one was a muscular, dark-skinned male with noticeably large lips and a bare head that was covered only with a row of bony spikes along the crest of his skull. Zamari, just like Araniro, nodded in greetings. Grimjo Jaeger Jaquez, the Sexta Espada. Ichigo narrowed his eyes when he looked over Grimjo. It was a muscular, though not as much as Zamari, male with light blue spiky hair and a penetrating gaze that sent shivers down Ichigo's spine. The man's attire seemed loose and, for the better or worse, Ichigo could think of only one word while looking at him. An animal. Noitra Gilga, the Quinto Espada. Finally moving his eyes from Grimjo, Ichigo felt another, similar vibe coming from Noitra. He was an extremely tall man with a thin and seemingly lanky body. If there wasn't a powerful Ryutsu seeping out of him, Ichigo was sure he would have thought of Noitra as somebody weak. However, while his body seemed fragile, his face brought unpleasant goosebumps all over Ichigo's body. It was set in a huge terrifying smile that revealed his long upper teeth. Ulquiorra Cipher, the Quattro Espada. I believe the two of you met already. Ichigo stared at Ulquiorra and tried not to let his emotions get the better of him. There was a myriad of thoughts, ideas, and plans running through his mind and he had to form a fist to prevent himself from outright attacking the man on the spot. Still, he was unable to stop himself from speaking. At the same time as he opened his mouth, Ulquiorra did the same. Trash. Trash. Somebody laughed and Ichigo narrowed his eyes at Ulquiorra, who seemed unfazed by the sudden turn of events. Standing next to Ichigo, Aizen clapped his hands once. Ah, I see you understand each other well. Good. Moving on. His hand moved towards the only female in the room and Ichigo felt his anger deflating like a balloon. Instead, a slight discomfort tickled his stomach and he had to try his hardest not to avoid looking at her. Tear Haribel, the Trace Espada. As his eyes darted from looking and not looking at her, there were some details he didn't notice but he was definitely sure Haribel was a female if only because of two large bulges beneath the fabric of her zipped jacket. She had short golden blonde hair and her skin seemed to be bit darker than his own, yet lighter than Zamari's. Barragan Luzenbern, the Segunda Espada. Glad to have an excuse not to continue looking at Haribel, Ichigo glanced at the next Espada. The first thing he noticed was that Barragan looked a lot older than anyone else in the room. He had a thick white mustache and completely white hair, which only further enhanced his elderly appearance. Still, despite his obvious age, he looked quite stocky and muscular. The other thing Ichigo noticed was a five-pointed crown set just above Barragan's forehead. Also, the man was looking at him with clear disdain and Ichigo hurriedly looked towards the last person in the room. Coyote Stark, the Primera Espada. Sup? Raising his eyebrows, Ichigo blinked in surprise. The Primera was the only Espada who greeted him vocally and he nervously nodded his head in return. Furthermore, the Primera looked so human-like, Ichigo briefly doubted he was even a hollow. The man had wavy, dark brown hair that ended at the base of his neck and a faded goatee. It was only when Ichigo noticed a fanged bottom jaw positioned below his neck that the teen realized Stark truly was a hollow. Now that we are all acquainted, I should inform you that Kurosaki Ichigo will stay with us for some time. Also, for those who are ready to object that it is pointless because Kurosaki just admitted to being weak, I can assure you of one thing. Aizen said politely, yet his voice felt commanding. He moved his hand so it pointed at Ichigo and continued speaking. Kurosaki is the only person who has the potential to become stronger than anyone in this room. Including me. As Ichigo widened his eyes in surprise, a multitude of voices rang across the room. What? Bullshit. A trash will always remain a trash. Interesting. A half of the Espada couldn't contain their emotions while the other half just stared at Ichigo with speculative, analyzing eyes that caused him to shift uncomfortably. In his mind, Ichigo cursed Aizen, but, at the same time, he tried to think of the reason behind such unnecessary words. Before he could think of anything, though, Aizen lightly tapped him on the shoulder. "Now, Kurosaki. Follow me and I'll show you to your quarters." Ichigo jumped from his mind to the real word and set a fixed gaze at the man. "You really had everything prepared?" Aizen just smiled. "All things happen according to a plan, Kurosaki. Including those that doesn't." It took Ichigo more than an hour to finally fall asleep, but once he did, he slept like a log. His room wasn't very spacious, there wasn't much furniture and it felt nothing like home yet. For some reason, it was the best sleep he had in weeks. No dreams, no nightmares, no nothing. Just a dip into the darkness where he floated without tormenting thoughts or emotions. He didn't know how long it lasted for and he didn't care. The only important thing was that once he woke up, he felt refreshed and more than just well rested. There wasn't any emergency and nobody called for him, a fact that allowed him to remain sprawled across his new bed with eyes pointed at the dim ceiling above him for another hour. He used the sudden influx of free time to just relax and think about nothing but also everything. Then he got to his feet. Aizen said, "I can do whatever I want for at least a few days, but I don't think I can just laze around. Maybe I'll just go train. It's probably the only thing I can do here." He thought and looked for his clothes, only to find them gone and replaced with something different. Interesting. Near his bed, hanging over a chair, was a new set of clothes. In contrast with his Shinigami attire, they were completely white and reminded him of the attire the Espada wore. Fortunately, even if it did surprise him, the new clothes seemed to have been similar to his old ones in a sense of being sleeveless. As he grabbed them and inspected them, he noticed the fabric was soft and pleasant to the touch. Shrugging, he slowly put them on, only to realize that his new attire consisted of normal Shinigami hakama and a long robe he had to put over it. Feels quite comfortable," he mumbled. Strapping his Zanpakuto to a red sash around his waist, he left the room and was on his way to the outside, where he could train in peace, when he bumped into an unfamiliar person. A carpet of green hair filled his vision and he almost lost his balance. "Oh, sorry." He apologized and glanced at the person to find a friendly-looking female shaking her head. "Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was in a hurry because Pesha and Don Kaka hid somewhere yet again and I'm not in a mood for games right now. Really, they should have known that now that I returned to my original form I won't behave like I did before and, look at me, I'm rambling again. I always seem to do that at the worst moment and..." The female babbled and then, when her eyes that had been darting all over the place settled on Ichigo's face, she trailed off and gave him an incredulous look. Who are you?" Ichigo's brain froze for a moment and the only thing he managed to do was stare at her with the same expression she had. Kurosaki Ichigo. His upbringing acted for him and he automatically introduced himself. The female scrunched up her chin, pursed her lips and, for a few seconds, she seemed to think. Then, as if she suddenly remembered something, her face lit up and then dried up. "Ah, you are the new guy, the Shinigami." An awkward silence fell between them. Seeing as she was finished talking, Ichigo tried to take a step forward, to leave, when she spoke again. "I'm Neliel Tuadalshwank." Ichigo glanced at her and saw her hand stuck forward. His brain briefly froze again and he stared at the hand, baffled. Neliel narrowed her eyes and slightly waved her hand. Shinigami don't greet each other. Blinking, Ichigo automatically grabbed her hand and shook it before he realized what was going on. A chill ran through him and he quickly withdrew his hand. Sorry. I'm not used to intelligent hollows," he blurted. Neliel narrowed her eyes further and Ichigo's brain finally restarted. He put his hand up in defense and started waving them from side to side. I didn't mean it like that. I'm sorry. No harm done. You look young so you probably haven't met many hollows in the first place." Without thinking, Ichigo continued to babble. Not many that looked, talked, and felt like a normal human. Neliel's eyebrows shot high but her expression mellowed a bit, Ichigo quickly nodded to her and hurried away, to save himself from further embarrassment. It felt like she wanted to speak more, but Ichigo didn't want to deal with it. The corridor they bumped into each other was far too narrow for him to be able to do that. It was just because of his surprise that he withstood standing so close to her without freaking out. You are panicking, Ichigo. Just take a deep breath. It's been a long time since it got this bad. I thought your condition got better. As he stumbled through the door leading outside of the building and the soles of his bare feet touched the sand, he formed a reply for his inner spirit. Why yeah, I thought so too. I don't know what happened. She surprised me. I didn't think a hollow could feel so much more human than some Shinigami do. Also, it's probably her body. She looks like a true woman. You know, big breast and wide hips and all. He mentally said and tried to catch his breath. So you did notice. Leaning against the wall for support, Ichigo's mind registered the answer and caused him to straighten his back and form a frown. What's that supposed to mean? However, his inner spirit withdrew from the conversation and left him without an answer. Slightly irritated, Ichigo took one more deep breath and then moved forward, to find a suitable place for training. When he found it, a small shadow below a large, cylindrical structure that was leaning to one side, he sat down and entered the pose known as Jinzen. With closed eyes, he spent nearly an hour trying to locate and communicate with his Zanpakuto spirit. He didn't succeed. Zanjutsu either couldn't hear him or stubbornly refused to do so. Either way, Ichigo was stuck without any option of communicating with the only other person in Hueco Mundo, besides Waiwak, that he knew. A bit angry, he growled and decided to try it one more time when he heard now a familiar voice coming from near him. That was rude, you know. I wasn't finished talking. His eyes snapped open, only for a female figure of Neliel Tuadalschwank to enter his vision. She was standing only few feet away from him and so he hurriedly scooted a bit further. Fortunately for him, she either didn't notice or decided to ignore that small action. Can I help you? He asked in a strained tone. Giving him an odd look, she plopped down on the ground, opposite of him, and stretched her arms. Then she shook her head. You are a bit weird, aren't you? She stated. Before he could object or get offended, she continued. Since you are new to this place, I was given the task of informing you about various things about Las Noches when you just ran away. Pushing himself a few inches further away from her, Ichigo just shrugged. He felt there was no need to apologize for something he couldn't have possibly known. When he remained silent, Neliel clearly took it as a sign and opened her mouth again. The one thing you should know is the hierarchy of Las Noches residents. There is Aizen-san, Ichimaru-san and Tisen-san. They act as the leaders. After them, there are Espada. They are 10 in total and their respective number represents their strength. The lower the number, the greater the power. What's wrong? Pale as death, Ichigo stared at Neliel in absolute shock with his eyes bugged out. Palms of his hands instantly turned moist from sweat and he felt his throat drying up. What he just heard was absurd and he had difficulty comprehending the implications. Ulk, that bastard. He's number 4. That means he's just the 4th strongest? And he still wiped the floor with me like I was a rug. No, even worse. He mentally rambled. Outwardly, he only managed to whisper. Son of a. He noticed Neliel looking at him strangely and so he quickly gulped and tried to get a hold on himself. The truth shook him but there was no point in dwelling on it. The only thing he could do was to train until even Ulquiorra seemed like a pebble on a road. Sorry, continue. Neliel quietly hummed but didn't seem that much interested in his thoughts, so she continued her explanation. As I said, Espada. After them, there are 2 groups that are more or less equal in terms of hierarchy, although not quite in terms of power. One group is called Fraction and they are subordinates of Espada. Each Espada has a right to have a Fraction but also a right to not have one. Most of them do but it's practically just a preference. For example, Segunda Espada's Fraction consists of 6 members, while Septima Espada has no Fraction at all. There, she paused and waited for Ichigo to nod as a sign he understood. He did and so she continued. An espada may be demoted either when he loses strength or ceases to be useful and, in most cases, they are demoted to the Privaran espada. A Privaran espada is still a powerful Arrancar, only outclassed by the members of espada. Neliel paused again, but this time because of Ichigo's frown. What is an Arrancar? I don't think I heard this term before. Blinking rapidly, it took Neliel a few seconds to speak again. Oh, I see. I thought, all right. Normally, Arrancar are a group of hollows that gain similar powers to that of a Shinigami by removing their masks. In doing so, they receive a variable boost in power and reasoning. Every single resident of Las Noches is one. However, most of the espada are Arrancars that Aizen-san created through means that are fairly unknown to me. Ichigo felt his brain getting overwhelmed with the number of questions that immediately popped up in his mind, and so he quickly raised one hand and outstretched it towards Neliel to stop her. Thinking fast, he cut out the most important part and let other thoughts move to the back of his mind, where he could ignore them for the time being. Hollow who removed their masks and are strong. Got it. Neliel's eyebrows bent ever so slightly, but she nodded and continued. The last group is Numeros. Most of them are average Arrancars and they are numbered from 11 to 99. An espada can choose some of them and then they become their fraction. Well, that's all for now. Any questions? Busy getting over the fact that there were at least 199 hollows within the buildings where he now slept, Ichigo barely realized she asked him a question. It was only when she tried to tap him on the shoulder that he noticed. Ah, yeah. So, Numeros and Espada are both ranked and numbered. What about Privaran Espada? Neliel slightly shook her head. Only Espada are ranked through their numbers. Numeros are given their number in order of their birth as Arrancars. Also, yes, I completely forgot to mention it. We are also given numbers that go from 100 up. Ichigo tilted his head and looked at her with some confusion in his eyes. We. Neliel's eyes opened wide. Right, I forgot to say. I am also a Privaran Espada. My number is not important. Ichigo stared at her quite intensely as another set of questions popped up in his mind, one more pressing than the other. However, it seemed being a Privaran Espada was not a subject Neliel wanted to discuss, so he decided not to press and ask. Then he realized that her being a Privaran meant that, at one point in time, she was an Espada. Strange, I don't feel a particularly strong Ryutsu from her. Maybe she's just good at handling it, though. Well, better than me at least. He thought and nodded shortly. Well, I have no other questions, so, thank you. He said and looked at her in a way which suggested he was expecting her to leave. However, Neliel either didn't notice it or chose not to. Simply leaning backwards, she remained sitting opposite of him and stared at the bright, blue sky. For some reason, Ichigo felt like he didn't want to be rude, but the thirst for training got the better of him. If you don't mind, I'd like to train for a bit. He stated and saw her lower her gaze from the sky to his face. She appeared to be baffled. Go on. Alone. Her eyebrows shot high. Oh. She slowly straightened her back but didn't stand up as Ichigo expected her to. What caused him to frown? She shrugged. I heard that you have the potential to get very strong. I'm interested. Ichigo clenched his jaw and lowered his upper eyelids in an irritated manner. Seeing that, Neliel formed something similar to a smile. She waited until he was done rolling his eyes and pointed at herself. Besides, I could help you train. It's been some time since I could spar with somebody. Most of these folks refuse to do so. Dissolving his previous expression, Ichigo looked at her with studying gaze. He tried to ignore the discomfort at seeing her shape and instead focused on seeing her with every other sense besides his sight. A stray thought formed in his brain. I may very well just accept. Zanjutsu's not talking to me and there is no way in hell I can train anything related to my Quincy side while in here. Also, I don't have any books on Kido, so that's out of the question as well. Besides, she used to be an Espada, so she's probably stronger than me. Yeah, what's the worst thing that could happen? He gave her a nod. Fine. It took Ichigo barely half an hour to find out just what exactly could go wrong after accepting Neliel's offer to spar. At first, it all began quite innocent. The two of them just exchanged some light blows, with each blow getting either parried, blocked or evaded. They both tried each other's battle in what seemed to be a friendly bicker. However, as time progressed, Neliel began to press more and more, until Ichigo felt like it was no longer just a light training. He cut. He sliced. He slashed. He ducked. He jumped. He flashed. He cut yet again. Nothing seemed to penetrate an iron-like defense of the female Arrancar. On the other hand, Neliel returned the favor with different results. He was cut. He was sliced. He was slashed. No matter what he tried, Ichigo knew he was way over his head. Ryotsu pouring from both of them held the same power, yet the difference in overall power was anything but equal. Only few times he got close to actually hitting her, but she always managed to escape from his reach at the very last moment. At first, Ichigo felt good about the spar, but with the passing time, that good feeling changed and turned into something twisted, something vile. She was beating him soundly and she barely broke a sweat. It was mind-numbing. Humiliating. Irritating. Infuriating. But also humbling and purifying. In his anger, he was just barely aware of the good points. His focus on the bad clouded his mind, weakened his judgment. With each new cut on his body and with each new droplet of his blood spilled, he fought less like a Shinigami and more like a hollow. There was still a reason within him. There was still a heart within him. But the instinct of the beast overshadowed both with an overwhelming dominance. Still, he remained sane and did not let his inner animal completely take over him. A small thing, a tiny fact engraved all over his reasonable part of the brain kept him lucid. It was just a spar and he was using only his base Zanpakuto. Breathing heavily, he put most of his remaining strength into the last strike, and when Neliel came at him from a spin, he ignored her blade and slashed at her as hard as he could. He felt a cold steel gnawing at his chest, but, to his surprise, he also saw his Zanpakuto cutting through Neliel's unguarded shoulder. The fabric of her attire gave up immediately and, after a brief struggle, so did her iron-like skin. A bit of blood spurted from her body. "I give up," Ichigo stated loudly and immediately hopped backwards. It seemed like he wasn't the only one keen on ending the spar, as Neliel did the same. With her free hand, she reached for the cut on her shoulder and let her fingers dip into the freely flowing tiny river of blood. She brought her bloody hand before her eyes. He was right. Since his wounds weren't exactly serious, Ichigo slowly plopped on the ground and let his regeneration do its work. "Excuse me." As if distracted, Neliel quickly lowered her hand and looked at him in a way that baffled him even further. There was a certain emotion in her eyes, and even though Ichigo didn't really want to believe it, he had to allow the possibility of him guessing it right. It was a look of approval. "Aizen-san. He was right about you having a great potential." Ichigo stared at her for a full minute before throwing his head backward and breaking into a wheezy chortle of amusement. "Wahaha. Are you kidding me? You completely destroyed me without even trying." He laughed till there were tears forming in the corners of his eyes. He was still chuckling when he looked back at the female Arrancar, only to find her staring at him in absolute seriousness. Curious, he formed an amused frown. "What? I'm not joking, Kurosaki Ichigo. And by the end of our spar, I was not going easy on you. From the beginning to the end, I could see and feel you improving. You steadily changed the flow of your attacks to adjust to my style. Slightly correcting the rhythm of your breathing, you began to keep up with my movements. And, without even knowing the thickness or strength of my arrow, you correctly gauged just how much power you needed to cut through it. Honestly, I'm baffled. I've never seen anyone improve so much over such little time. It's like you're a sponge, just soaking up every single detail of the battle without even knowing it," she said lengthily and left Ichigo staring at her with stunned expression. He was expecting anything but certainly not such good-natured compliments. It took him by surprise and caused the part of his brain responsible for speaking to turn itself off. He could hear his inner spirit saying something witty, but he paid it no mind. With his lower jaw hanging loose, he continued to stare at her for what seemed to be hours. "It was just a fluke. I got lucky," he muttered, and his eyes darted in every direction, while one of his hands shot towards his head and scratched it. It had been a long time, but Ichigo felt embarrassed. Taking pity on him, Neliel formed a small smile. Be that as it may, you did better than I expected. Without warning, a large spiritual pressure crashed on Ichigo's shoulders and caused him to widen his eyes in alarm. Instantly abandoning his unease from Neliel's compliments, he quickly scanned his surroundings. With slightly narrowed eyes, he located the origin of the Ryotsu and bit the inside of his mouth. Espada number 5. He did better than expected? It's you who did worse than expected, Neliel. There, in a short distance away from them stood Noitra, the Quinto Espada, with his teeth bared and his face twisted in a derisive and arrogant sneer. The Ryotsu pouring out of him was visible to the naked eye, and Ichigo took note that it was yellow in color. Ichigo glanced at Neliel, who seemed unaffected by the pressure, as she returned Noitra's look with a bored glance. As always, you act like a beast and not like an intelligent person, Noitra. Whatever you want, take it and leave, she said loudly. However, Noitra seemed to ignore her words and took a few steps towards her. With a menacing look in his eyes, his hand moved towards the hilt of his sword, but before he could grab it, Neliel released a pulse of her own Ryotsu. Ichigo quickly noted it was almost equal to Noitra's. Are you going to go against Aizen-san's orders, Noitra? The two of us are prohibited from fighting ever again, and no matter what you say or how much you try and taunt me, I will not break that order. Noitra's expression dried up and turned sour. Unwillingly, he stopped moving his hand and let it hang loose. Then he hit her with a piercing glare. Do not think you are safe for even a second, Neliel. Just because you were given a second chance at being here, do not forget the scar on your mask. I can give you another one and nobody could stop me. Not even Aizen. Staring at Neliel from behind her, Ichigo's eyes bugged out when he heard that. He was sure Noitra couldn't beat Aizen even in his wildest dreams, but that wasn't the part he took note of. Privaran Espada can be demoted after losing power to be an Espada. Is he the one who caused it? Noitra's words clearly struck something, and Ichigo noticed Neliel's hands forming fists. She didn't move and gave no indication of having any desire to fight, yet he could feel the emotions pouring out of her. Really? Last time, you needed a help from another. You can't do anything alone, Noitra, and do you know why? Because you are just an animal. A beast that is kept together only with its instinct for killing and destruction. Somebody like you can never beat me alone. From the distance, Ichigo wasn't sure whether he saw right or wrong, but he got the impression Noitra's brow twitched in anger. The Espada formed a seething grimace and his tongue came out from his mouth, a yellow energy gathering at its tip. There is no place for a woman on the battlefield. Especially not for you, Neliel. Eat this. Hurriedly getting back on his feet, Ichigo watched in horror as a large blast of hollow energy shot from Noitra's mouth in form of a powerful Zero. To his shock, Neliel didn't move an inch and seemingly just waited for the attack to strike her right in the face. He opened his mouth to yell at her, but then she opened her mouth and swallowed the whole Zero like he always swallowed Yuzu's dinner. After a brief pause, Neliel opened her mouth and returned the same Zero, though clearly enhanced, to its owner. Surprised by this development, Noitra barely evaded the powerful blast as it roared past him until it exploded in a sand dune, far away from their location. Ichigo could see the staring match between the two Arancars and waited for their next move. However, both Neliel and Noitra turned away from each other, marking the end of the short dispute with a loud silence. Well, that was interesting. Chapter 34, Tools to Reach the Heavens, A Stepping Stone. The day following the dispute, Ichigo received an invitation to one of Aizen's rooms. He contemplated not going, but, from the wording alone, he understood it was that kind of invitation he couldn't refuse. Because of that, he reluctantly walked numerous stairs that led to his destination with a frown etched on his face. Once he arrived to the entrance, he heard Aizen's voice. Come inside, Kurosaki. Suppressing the urge to sigh deeply, Ichigo tightened his jaw and opened the doors. The first thing he noticed was almost complete lack of light. The only illumination within the room came from the second thing he noticed, a large computer screen positioned in the center of the room. In front of it, Aizen sat on a couch that looked so comfortable, Ichigo had to stop himself from joining the man. Instead, he just walked near and stood next to it. You wanted to see me? Briefly looking away from the screen and at Ichigo, Aizen curved his mouth into a smile. "No need to be so formal," he said, and then turned his attention back to the screen. "I wanted you to see this." Ichigo glanced at the screen and realized it was showing a live transmission from Siri. Surprised and confused, he stared at it with a frown. Surely, Aizen didn't call him just to watch everyday life in Seoul society. See what, exactly? Aizen tapped the spot on the couch next to him, but Ichigo politely shook his head, prompting the man to smile again. "My gift to Godi 13. Was all he said, and Ichigo understood it as a sign to continue looking at the screen. For a few minutes, nothing happened and the life in Siri passed in an ordinary way. Shinigami officers patrolled the area as usual. Nothing seemed out of normal. However, then he noticed a small, chaotic movements in the upper right corner of the screen. Slowly, several academy students came into his view and he narrowed his eyes. "What's wrong with them?" he asked after a brief observation. The students' steps looked uncertain, but, because of the lack of focus, he couldn't tell the expression on their faces. Aizen raised one hand and placed a finger to his mouth. "SHH, it should begin shortly." Still confused, Ichigo looked at the live transmission again. The students moved slowly, but only until the patrol noticed them. When it happened, the Shinigami officers seemed to call out to them and, for a moment, it looked like there was a conversation. Straining his ears as much as he could, Ichigo was unable to listen to it. The transmission offered barely any sound. But then, the Shinigami patrol took out their swords and assumed fighting stances, an action that only further increased Ichigo's confusion. Then, almost as if on order, the students began to bend over and vomit an odd white substance. Breaking the rules of gravity, the substance didn't flow downwards but, instead, quickly made its way back to the students' faces and formed hollow masks on each of them. "What the hell?" Ichigo exclaimed and looked at Aizen in horror. But the man continued to smile. When the students roared and leaped towards the patrol, ready to kill them, Aizen spoke. "Some days ago, around the time you came to Hueco Mundo, I had my subordinates take all of the students that used to regularly attend my calligraphy class and take them here, to Las Noches." Staring at Aizen with horror and disgust, Ichigo tried not to look at the screen, but the sound still entered his ears. A sound of a battle, desperation, and determination. "What did you do?" Aizen hummed to himself. "Just to be clear, I handpicked every student that attended my class. Every single one of them was, not a person. They were all vile, brutal, and guilty creatures. It may have seemed different during the class, but that's only because of my influence. I picked them because I knew what kind of dark secrets they all held. That's why, after they got here, I infected all of them with a holofication virus." He explained casually, clearly not worried of the increasing riots pouring out of Ichigo. Vivid anger spread through Ichigo's veins as he had to physically hold himself from outright attacking Aizen, who simply continued to watch. "Why? That's..." Words were failing Ichigo as he finally looked back at the screen, only to see the patrol starting to turn into hollows as well. Another patrol arrived and the process repeated itself. Every time they received an injury, the ordinary Shinigami began to turn into ones with hollow masks. Seeing that with his very own eyes, Ichigo was reaching boiling point fast. However, by the time a third patrol arrived, this time larger in number and also in power, all of the Shinigami who turned started to behave differently. Their movements sketchy. Before the third patrol managed to attack, they all just fell unconscious. Even their masks began to disappear. "What?" Ichigo felt his head spinning and had to lean on the couch for support. He went from being absolutely livid to completely baffled in less time than that it would take Rukia to kick him in the shin. "I may appear monstrous, Kurosaki, but I'm not a complete monster. Obviously, I can't call myself innocent, as that would be an insult to everyone's intelligence, but I'm also not a man without a plan. What you just witnessed was a multi-purpose plan." When Ichigo didn't react, Aizen continued. "You see, by doing this, I demonstrated that I can do anything. Doing this, I created a chaos, a period of uncertainty that will force the Godi to grow. Last but not least, I supplied the Godi with a sample of a perfected and mostly harmless hollow pathogen, and I'm sure Mayuri Kuratsuka will not waste this opportunity to grab it for a study. Right now, You may think of this last reason as pointless, but, in the long run, it is something that may help prevent a terrible future. It was hard to tell time in Las Noches, but Ichigo was sure at least half a day must have passed since he walked out of Aizen's room with his head heavy and full of thoughts that were hard to deal with. What he had witnessed left an impression on him, and he wasn't sure whether good or bad. It was his first time seeing Aizen for what he truly was, a scheming genius and a master manipulator. He tried to take Aizen's words as the truth, but there was just so much coincidence that it was almost impossible to believe the man. Ichigo thought it was nothing short of a miracle that nobody actually died during the attack of the Hollow-Fied students, yet Aizen claimed it was all according to the plan. That he never intended to kill anyone with his strategy, and that it was all for the purpose of helping the Godai. Adamant about his intentions, Aizen rejected Ichigo's thoughts about it being a product of pure luck. Still, Ichigo was a stubborn person, and convincing him proved to be much even for the former captain. On the other hand, he didn't press further and let Ichigo go with just a simple request. To wait and see. Keeping it in mind, Ichigo found it hard to deal with everything at once, and so he left to do one thing he could. To train. He sought out the spot where he had previously trained and prepared to train, only to be greeted with the sight of Neliel already waiting for him. Not one to be known for his idiocy, Ichigo let go of the thought of telling her to leave and decided to train with her. This time, however, their spar turned out to be less violent, and they both kept from actually injuring each other. Their regeneration was fast, but, depending on the severity of the wound, it bit off a fair amount of energy that could be instead used to train longer. The spar eventually developed into something akin to a lesson, and Ichigo realized he was, for once, quite enjoying himself. All good things had to end, though, and after no more than an hour, during one of the pauses between spars, presence of a large spiritual pressure woke Ichigo from the moment of relax. I know this spiritual energy, he thought with a frown, and turned his attention towards the spot where it seemed to be coming from. Immediately, his frown turned into a scowl. Kurosaki Ichigo. Prepare for a rematch. A large figure of Espada number 10, Yami, was closing in on him fast. Sword already drawn, the Aaron car was releasing quite a good amount of Ryoryoku, almost as if trying to scare him. I don't think Aizen-san would approve. Neliel stood up and threw an admonishing stare at Yami, who raised one eyebrow at her before cackling menacingly. Why would he care? We were only told not to kill him. There was nothing about beating the shit out of him. Standing up as well, Ichigo put out an arm in front of Neliel and sized up the Aaron car with a reluctant glare. I already told you I don't want to fight you. Yami laughed. Because you are scared. Bullshit. You just don't want to lose. Either way, you can't refuse. I still have to repay you for cutting off my arm. He roared and raised his sword high above his head, only to bring it down on Ichigo with revenge. Growling in indignation, Ichigo quickly put his Zanpakuto up to block the strike. When the two blades met, he could feel his arms shaking under the weight of the blow. Now we're talking. Prepare for a beatdown, Kurosaki Ichigo. The two of them separated and then jumped at each other again. From the corner of his eye, Ichigo saw Neliel resign and move to a respectable distance, away from the fight. However, he couldn't afford to look at her for long as Yami's hand moved towards his head at frightening speed. He ducked and slashed at his opponent at the same time. Keeping his riot so sharp, he could feel the edge of his blade cutting through Yami's defense. He heard him grunt and, once he reached the spot behind him, he spun around just in time to deflect another blow. There was a thin red line running across Yami's stomach where he had cut him. With his opponent's face pushed in his own, Ichigo vaulted over the Aaron car and slashed him on the shoulder while doing so. Another red line appeared on Yami's body and the Aaron car's face twisted into an angry snarl. Just as Ichigo landed, he saw a large fist coming right at his skull and he hurriedly put up his Zanpakuto to try and block it. GHH. He grunted when the strength of the punch sent him skidding through the sand. Still, he didn't feel much pain and that fact kicked up his drive to fight. Shifting his weight, he flashed back to his opponent and planned to blitz past him, but Yami's large fist moving towards him prevented him from doing so. In an attempt to avoid crashing into it, Ichigo leaped in the air, but Yami moved with surprising speed and his arm brushed against Ichigo's feet. Unable to remain in control of his flight, Ichigo knew he would soon fall face first in the sand. Quickly devising his next step, he let himself fall and then nimbly rolled to the side. Where his chest had just been, Yami's large fist appeared. I don't recall him being this fast. The blow raised a curtain of sand and allowed Ichigo to get back on his feet, unseen. Immediately, he leaped in the air as his opponent didn't seem like the one who liked aerial battle. It was a good thing he did so as Yami's elbow tore through the veil of sand and hit the air where he had just stood. Briefly observing the Eren car from above, Ichigo felt tempted to use more of his arsenal than just his Zanpakuto. No. He wants to beat the shit out of me, so if I can do it instead and using as little power as possible, it should send a clear signal, though I guess I won't hold back if it doesn't work. Get back here, you little shit. Raising one eyebrow, Ichigo didn't need to hear more and flashed back to the ground, near the yelling Eren car. This time, he made sure to see ahead, and when he saw Yami charging towards him with an intention of performing some sort of a lariat on him, he pushed his body to the limit. Using every bit of speed, he blitzed around him and, in a rapid succession, slashed him twice across his back. A pulsating red cross mark formed on the Eren car's body and a bit of blood spurted from the wounds. Gah! You're dead. When Yami shouted, Ichigo tried to back away but was taken by surprise when Yami spun on the spot and backhanded him before he could even react. Shit. The pure physical force behind the surprise strike sent him flying through the air, until he crashed into the wall of a nearby oblique building. His body sank into the concrete and forced the breath out of his lungs. Gasping for it, Ichigo slid down and touched his head with his free hand. He still hits like a truck, but I'm okay. I'm okay. He thought and tried to ignore the ringing in his ears. Eat this. The unfriendly voice roared across the battlefield, and Ichigo quickly raised his head to see a red ball of energy forming in front of Yami's opened mouth. Zero. Just as the rumbling noise of Zero filled the area, Ichigo acted fast. Whispering his release phrase, he swung his Zanpakuto down and released a powerful blast of his own. Getsuga Tensho. The two strikes collided in midair and showered the sand with powerful, leaking Ryuryoku. The struggle for dominance was short and ended in Ichigo's favor. His Getsuga sliced through Yami's Zero like a blade and hit the shocked Eren car right in the face. Ichigo, now with two swords in his grasp, waited until the smoke cleared. His instinct was telling him to move and finish the battle with one decisive strike, but he remained still. He fought Yami for a reason and not for the kill. There wasn't any point in attacking further if his Getsuga did enough damage. When the smoke from Getsuga hitting Yami finally cleared up, Ichigo knew he did well in suppressing his instinct. Half of his opponent's body was scorched and the Eren car was bent forward, breathing heavily. Blood poured out of a large gash on his chest and he seemed to be struggling to keep standing. But then he straightened his back and began punching the air in front of him while releasing small but fast pulses of red energy. I'm going to kill you, Kurosaki. Ichigo had only a fraction of a second to think. He contemplated using another Getsuga to blast the incoming blasts but didn't want to go overboard and accidentally kill the Eren car. In the end, he simply flashed to the side. One of the blasts still touched his side and ate a piece of his skin, but he evaded the rest of them. Before Yami could send another wave of attacks, Neliel suddenly appeared behind him and hit him in the back of his head with her hand posing as a blade. Instantly, Yami lost his consciousness and toppled over. In response, Ichigo showed Neliel thumbs up and slowly sat down, to enjoy the moment of victory and to let himself heal. He glanced at his bleeding side and sighed. Well, that went better than I expected. In a dimly lit room, Aizen stared at the only source of light in the room, a large screen similar to the one he had showed Ichigo, and watched as Yami's large figure fell on the ground, soundly defeated. The image then moved to zoom on a satisfied Ichigo as he leaned back and stared at the sky. A smile formed on Aizen's lips. It came as a surprise to Ichigo, but once he walked away from the fight with Yami, his body sent him several signs of having a serious fatigue. He was surprised because he thought he hadn't received that many blows or sustained that many wounds. However, once he reached his quarters, he fell face first on the bed and slept for so long, it was the sound of his stomach growling that woke him up. Can't complain much, though. I feel like a new person. He muttered through the pillow and rolled over, so that he lay on his back. There was much he wanted to think about, but his stomach had different plans and began to growl so much, he had no other choice but to go eat. It was when he was finishing his meal when he felt, rather than heard, somebody approaching him. He thanked the errand car that provided him with the dish and turned around before the newcomers could reach him. It was Aizen and the Septima Espada, Zamari. "Ah, there you are, Kurosaki," Aizen said. Ichigo moved his chair backwards so he could stand up, but Aizen slightly waved his hand to stop him. "Please don't. There is something I want to talk about with you." Curious, Ichigo raised one eyebrow, and when Aizen sat on a chair opposite of him, he glanced at Zamari, who remained standing. "Well, I say talk, but actually there is something I'd like you to do for me, Kurosaki." Ichigo's brows slid towards each other and slowly formed a frown. "I'm listening," he retorted, to which the corners of Aizen's mouth twitched upwards and created a small smile. "Good. You've been my guest for a few days now, but everyone who wants to live in Las Noches for an extended period of time has to bring something to the table. You have to contribute to overall welfare. With this in mind, I have a mission for you. You'd go with Zamari here, of course, as it is by no means a mission suited for you." Listening carefully, Ichigo's frown deepened with each word Aizen uttered. "Punishment then?" Aizen chuckled, but Ichigo felt it was fake. "I'd like to call it a chance to prove yourself and to prove your new loyalty to Las Noches." There wasn't anything else he could do, so Ichigo briefly nodded to force Aizen to speak further. Aizen didn't need much convincing and was clearly prepared for Ichigo to accept. "There is something I'd like you to borrow from Shirai. I'm sure you know some things about noble clans from your time at the academy," Aizen asked, to which Ichigo nodded again. "I know that their role in Soul Society's life is quite unclear." Aizen's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile of somebody who knew things. Dirty things, secrets. Seeing it made Ichigo mentally shudder. That couldn't be more right, Kurosaki. The noble clans are many things, but one thing they aren't, is a blessing. They are nothing but a black spot. An appalling, ugly and vulgar thing of a past. Though the minor noble clans are nothing in comparison with the four great noble clans. They are the true, well, as Ulquiorra likes to say, trash. They are the remnants of the greatest sin ever committed, but that is for some other time. As he said that, Aizen's smile turned ugly and outright scary, causing Ichigo to subconsciously move away, till his back was firmly pressed against his chair. Aizen must have noticed it, because he quickly changed his expression and replaced it with a neutral gaze. "Important thing is, the thing that I want is securely stashed away in the Shihoin compound. Before you leave, I'll show you the exact image of how it looks, so memorize it well. You'll learn what it is once you return. Now, you are probably wondering why you'll be going with Zamari." "Zamari?" Aizen asked, and Zamari immediately responded. "My Sonido is the fastest out of every Espada." Ichigo narrowed his eyes, but Aizen continued. "Moving fast is what I need you to do. This mission will require stealth. Anything else will only slow you down, therefore I will supply you with Ryotsu masking clothes, the kind of which I have mentioned to you once before." Ichigo's expression went through a menacing phase, but he managed to stay calm. "These cloaks can mask your Ryotsu output to a certain amount. They can also hide you from the plain sight for as long as you don't move and don't release spiritual energy. Perfect tools for this kind of mission. However, I am quite sure Kurotsukima Yuri added a new layer of security to Soul Society, so I expect the Godei will know someone entered Shirai as soon as you emerge from the Garganta." Slightly tilting his head, Ichigo looked at Aizen with a funny thought in his mind. "That is one risky plan, Aizen. I thought you planned everything to the very last detail." Only after he spoke Ichigo realized he may have sounded too arrogant, but, fortunately, Aizen took it with humor. The man chuckled and shortly nodded his head. "True. Very true, Kurosaki. Though I have to ask you. What makes you think this mission being risky isn't my plan?" For some reason, Ichigo thought traveling through Garganta would be the same as going through the Senkaimon. That he would just enter and then appear right in Shirai. However, the second he stepped inside the Garganta he realized his mistake. Whoa! The space within Garganta was hard to describe. It was a void of sorts Ichigo had never seen before. Uncertain range of colors glimmered all around, making it look like a world straight out of hallucinogen-induced dreams where nothing was real and everything was surreal. A turbulence of reishi was ever present and made it hard to keep a grip on his spiritual sense. Freaky. He muttered and watched Zamari seemingly land on nothing, but at closer inspection he noticed a pad made of spiritual particles below his feet that kept him afloat. Ah, so that's the way. Releasing a bit of his energy, Ichigo created an unstable underlay that turned solid once his feet touched it. Zamari didn't turn around to look at him, so Ichigo decided not to waste time and followed him. As he did so, his eyes nervously darted around. Whatever the Garganta was, it made him feel small and insignificant. Shuddering, he patted one of his pockets to make sure a small vial full of red liquid was securely hidden in it. I guess having an access to her blood means Yoriuki is still alive, just kept away from plain sight. He wasn't even sure why, but the realization made him sigh in relief. Was it guilt? Ichigo didn't know, and he sure as hell didn't want to think about it during the mission. So much could go wrong with it, and he didn't want to be the one who would make an error. With that in mind, he silently trailed after Zamari and mentally reminded himself the image of what he had to steal from Siriti. Borrow. He quickly corrected himself, appalled to hear himself saying it in Aizen's voice. Several long minutes later, maybe even more than an hour, Ichigo saw Zamari slow down. The Arrancar slightly turned his head so he could glance at Ichigo and nodded to him. "We're here. Prepare yourself." With a gulp, Ichigo nodded in return. Quietly, he put a hood over his head, and while Zamari opened the entrance to Siriti, he closed up his cloak, so that his whole body became concealed. Now. The gate opened and both of them jumped through it. Immediately, before Ichigo was able to absorb his surroundings and find out where exactly they landed, his ears were assaulted by a high-pitched sound of an alarm. "Shit!" He whispered nervously and motioned Zamari, who stood next to him, not to move an inch. It was a good thing he did so, as only a few seconds later, a Shinigami patrol swept through their location. When the patrol passed the two of them without even a glance in their direction, Ichigo knew the cloaks truly were working. He waited for a few more seconds, and when nobody else showed up, he looked at Zamari. "All right. I think I know where we are. If we move quickly, quietly, and carefully, I think we can reach the Shihoin compound in just under an hour. Follow me." He whispered as quietly as he could and hoped the Arrancar heard him. To his relief, Zamari nodded. "They know about us." It was quite funny to hear Zamari, who had quite a deep voice, trying to speak soft, but Ichigo restrained from snorting. Instead, he shrugged. "Not like we didn't expect them to," he whispered, and then turned around. Peeking around a corner of a nearby wall, he heard, saw and felt nobody, so he stood up and turned towards the direction of the wanted location. In a shimmer of dim light, he flashed away with Zamari right at his heels. As they moved through the Siriti, unseen and unheard, Ichigo was very glad it was nighttime. While the cloaks clearly worked as intended, having the dark night cloaking them with its blackness relaxed his mind and body and allowed him to think and act with a mind that was as clear as a spring water. His estimations were correct, and they reached the large Shihoin compound in just under 60 minutes. When the guards standing at the entrance came into his sight, Ichigo stopped moving via Shunpo and motioned Zamari to stop using his high-speed movement as well. This close to the family that consisted of trained assassins, it was unwise to use any kind of spiritual energy. They needed to turn invisible at a moment's demand, and using Ryuryoku delayed the effect. Ichigo went even further and decided words were unnecessary as well, and so he just pointed a finger at the large wall in front of them and then at a tree behind them. It seemed Zamari understood, if his indignation was any sign. Without wasting a second, Ichigo walked to the tree and started to climb it the usual human way with only his hands and feet. Even then, he stopped every few seconds to check whether the sound he was making caused any suspicion. It didn't. Step by step, Ichigo reached the top of the tree. He waited until Zamari was next to him and then jumped forward, over the wall of the compound. Again, using just the natural strength of his legs. He landed on a soft grass and watched as Zamari followed his lead a second later. Good. Now, I have to check. He thought and made a motion with his hand that looked like he was pushing the air to the ground. Once again, he hoped Zamari understood. When he saw the Arrancar not moving, he nodded to himself and, From his other pocket, took out a small map of the Shihoin compound, courtesy of Aizen. I see, so we'll have to go through the residential area either way. That's risky, but I guess we have no choice. Still crouching, he began to walk in the nearest house direction. It was a killer for his knees, but, so far, he was meticulous about being careful and he didn't want to get cocky. He still remembered his defeat at Yoryuki's hands, and because of that, he held any member of the Shihoin clan in high regard. Alarm was still going strong, but it seemed like there was no panic, so Ichigo concluded the Godei knew that somebody got through, but they didn't know the identity of the invader. Which was good. Ichigo didn't want them to see him for more than one reason. Before long, they moved through the house, stopping every time the ground beneath their feet made even the tiniest noise. Thankfully, because it was long past midnight, only guards and few servants were still awake. It made things easier than he had hoped for, and in barely 20 more minutes, they reached the heart of the compound, the Shihoin vault. It was a large construct covered with intricate drawings and marks. Ichigo suspected they were all parts of Kido seals that were undoubtedly protecting the vault from being broken in. A stray ray of moonlight briefly fell on the vault and, cursing mentally, Ichigo took a fast step backwards. Because of the night, he almost didn't notice a translucent barrier surrounding the whole construct like a dome of inflated air. Holy damn! 1 inch from blowing the whole mission up. Good job, Ichigo. Glancing at Zamari, who watched him with curious gaze, Ichigo reached into his pocket and took out the small vial that was filled with Yoryuki's blood. Carefully, he undid the seal on top of it and tilted the vial so a small amount of blood landed on the palm of his other hand. He suppressed his disgust and smeared the blood all over his palm. After he was done, he raised his bloodied hand and cautiously placed it on the surface of the translucent barrier. Without making any sound, the barrier popped like a balloon. Ichigo allowed himself a small sigh of relief. But it wasn't over yet. Taking a few careful steps forward, he got close to the opening of the vault and looked it over until he found a small engraving. He placed the opening of the vial right next to it and then poured all of the remaining blood into the engraving. The whole construct began to flash in dim dark light. Is that good? Ichigo gulped and peeked above his shoulder at Zamari, but the Arrancar seemed confused. With no other choice but to wait, Ichigo watched his surroundings in case somebody unexpectedly showed up. He heard a quiet clacking sound and turned his attention back to the vault. A small hole opened in the middle of it and Ichigo reached into the same pocket where he had kept the vial. Rummaging through it, he took out the last thing Aizen had given them, a single strand of Yoryuki's hair. While he wasn't sure why hair, it dawned on him that if the security so far needed blood, the last protection most likely needed to check for the identity in a different way. Not wanting to waste more time, he aimed for the hole and plunged the hair in it. The hole closed up, the construct flashed one more time and then the vault opened. Ichigo released a deep, strained sigh of relief. But his satisfaction lasted only until he noticed the contents of the vault. That's not everything we were supposed to take. Where's the rest? He thought. His brows forming a frown, he glanced at Zamari, who mimicked his expression but otherwise offered no help or advice. Disgruntled, Ichigo decisively reached for the inside of the vault and took out the treasure. He tapped the vault and it immediately closed up. After he took several steps backwards, the protective barrier reappeared. For a moment, Ichigo weighed his options. Should we look for the rest? We still have some time before dawn, but I have a feeling we won't find it. Maybe there is another vault Aizen didn't know about. Or, oh, shit. Just when he was reaching a conclusion, Ichigo heard quiet footsteps closing in on them and he scooted away, to the corner of the room, and together with Zamari, they watched a fairly small figure enter the room. Ne-sama. Ichigo widened his eyes in surprise. He wasn't able to determine whether the voice belonged to a male or female, but it definitely sounded young. Moreover, it asked for an older sister. Sister. Yoryuki, her sibling. Rapidly blinking, Ichigo quickly put 2 and 2 together. The figure remained still for a moment and then, shocking Ichigo, it turned towards him, almost as if it was looking straight at him. Ichigo gulped. Ne-sama. The voice suddenly sounded unsure and suspicious. Ichigo's mind charged into overdrive and he furiously tried to think of a plan. When the figure took a small step towards him, He acted. With a flick of a wrist, he sent the empty vial flying through the air. When it hit the wall on his right, it smashed into pieces in a loud noise that caused the figure to jump towards the noise. Without wasting a second, Ichigo stood up and flashed through the empty corridor, until he landed on a small grass outside the house. He felt Zamari next to him. He didn't even bother looking at him and handed him one of the larger things he took from the vault. Then he whispered, "Move. Quickly. Now." The Aaron car didn't need more and immediately left. Not even a second later, Ichigo could hear a swish of somebody else moving towards him and he quickly followed after Zamari. In one leap, he vaulted over the wall of the compound and then dashed as fast as he could towards the designated spot from where they were supposed to return to Hueco Mundo. However, as much as he was pushing himself, he could still hear and feel somebody trailing after him. Shit. He was sure that the cloak was working and his Ryotsu was masked, but since he was using spiritual energy, it couldn't conceal him from plain sight. Still, the thought of somebody seeing him while he was using his fastest Shunpo baffled him. It's definitely not any captain of the Godai, so who the hell can be this fast? Something small hit him in the right calf and almost caused him to lose his balance. Whoever was pursuing him was definitely faster than him and was starting to gain on him. Ichigo felt he was starting to lose options. If he couldn't outrun his pursuer, there was only so much he could do but fight. Yet Ichigo didn't want to do that. Getting into a fight would only alert the others of his location, and soon after that he would get swarmed by the Godai and his odds of getting away would drop drastically. So, he did the only thing he thought of and slightly turned in mid-shunpo. Heido number 1, show. A small amount of kinetic energy shot from his index finger, but he didn't look at the results of his spell. Instead, he turned back and sped up even more. For a few moments, it seemed his action had some effect as his pursuer lost some of the distance he had gained on him. But it lasted only for so long. When Ichigo saw Zamari waiting on him with an opened gate, he nodded to him to go. Just when he was about to head inside himself, his pursuer finally overtook him and landed between him and the Garganta gate. "Stop immediately." Ichigo mentally cursed and hit the brakes. Then he noticed the person's appearance and felt surprise spreading through him. Mini Yoriuki. In front of him stood a young, dark-skinned person with black hair tied into a thick ponytail. The person looked exactly like a smaller version of Yoriuki, hence the Mini Yoriuki comparison. Now, Ichigo had no doubts about the person being Yorikai's sibling. The similarity was way too striking for anything else. The only thing he was unsure of was the person's gender. "Who are you and how did you get Nesama's blood? Did you kill her?" The person was shaking in anger and Ichigo couldn't find any fault in that. If somebody showed up with the blood of his sister, he would murder them on the spot. In light of that, he realized he was quite lucky he wasn't being attacked, yet. He kept his head lowered, so that the hood would keep his face concealed, and shook his head. He didn't dare to use his voice. "Show yourself and surrender. As the 23rd head of the Shihoin clan, I vow to keep you alive until your hearing. Resist and you'll die by my hands." The loud exclamation rang in Ichigo's ears and made him click his tongue. If nobody noticed the furious chase through the Siriti, they must have heard this person's voice. As if listening to him, several strong spiritual signatures popped up from a distance. "Damn it!" he cursed. There was no way he was going to surrender and he also didn't want to fight, but it seemed the person in front of him wasn't going to let him pass without it. He remained still for a few seconds and let the cloak do its job and turn him invisible. "Your tricks are useless. You aren't fast enough." Ichigo wanted to snort but he didn't. Instead, he raised his index finger while making sure his cloak didn't move and broke the invisibility. He took a short breath and released a burst of Ryuryoka through the finger in form of another Heido number 1, show. The spell immediately broke his invisibility, but it also took the person in front of him by surprise and pushed it out of the way. Instantly, Ichigo took the chance and leapt into the Garganta gate that seemed to be getting smaller. As he passed through, he could feel a hand on his head pulling the hood off. There was a loud gasp coming from behind him and then the gate closed completely. Check the description for the links to the author.